Somewhere beyond the streetlights, where the night deepens into a shade too heavy for sleep and too quiet for comfort, a signal drifts through the dark, thin, wandering, almost shy, until it finds you exactly where you are, lying awake while the rest of the world pretends to dream. Welcome, night traveler, to this small corner of the airwaves, a place where the hum of the city fades to a soft pulse and the stories we keep buried rise like mist along an empty road. Here, under the dim glow of a lonely hour, we explore the moments people don't speak of in daylight, the things glimpsed in passing headlights, the voices carried on forest winds, the shadows that sit just behind the mirror, waiting for you to notice them. So settle in. Loosen the breath you've been holding. Let the dark draw its careful circle around you. Because tonight, as the world sleeps, we'll walk together through 7 tales stitched from silence, memory, and the strange places where ordinary lives quietly unravel. And if the stories feel familiar, if something in them feels a little too close, it's only because the night has a way of revealing what was always there, just out of sight. The dead end call. The desert always felt different at 3 in the morning, not empty the way people imagine but strangely attentive, as if the vast darkness between the scattered mesas leaned in to listen to the quiet growl of Liam's truck as it pushed its way across Interstate 99, the headlights cutting through drifting sheets of sand that slid across the asphalt like pale ghosts dragging the night behind them, and he kept one hand on the wheel while the other tapped idly against the cracked leather, trying to push back the exhaustion that rose and fell in steady waves as the road stretched ahead without a single curve or companion. Nothing but the low thrum of the engine and the faint static whispering through the radio like someone breathing just a little too close to the microphone, and he saw the moon reflected in the chrome edges of the dashboard, a thin silver bruise hanging above a landscape that seemed stripped of anything living, where even the cacti hunched like tired silhouettes trying to disappear into the hard soil, and Liam felt that familiar ache of long-distance loneliness settling somewhere deep behind his ribs, the kind that grows heavier the farther you get from any place with lights or people or the comfort of knowing someone could hear you if something went wrong, and perhaps that was why, when his phone, long dead to service out here, vibrated in the cup holder with a sudden sharp buzz that made the hairs on his arms lift, he glanced down with more curiosity than concern, though that curiosity crystallized into a quiet, icy thread of dread when he saw the words unknown caller glowing on the screen despite the tiny icon in the corner insisting he had no signal at all, and he hesitated only a second before answering, bringing the phone to his ear as the desert wind brushed against the truck's frame like fingers testing the edges of a door, and at first there was nothing but heavy breathing, a slow uneven rhythm like someone struggling to keep quiet, then the faintest choked sob, fragile and raw, and a woman's voice broke through the static with a frightened whisper that sounded as if it had traveled a long way, too long, to reach him, telling him she didn't know where she was exactly, only that her car had died near a place called Dead Man's Curve, her words trembling as though something in the darkness beyond her had teeth, and Liam straightened in his seat because that stretch was infamous among truckers, a narrow bend on an old back road where the desert dropped sharply into a ravine and the guardrails had never been replaced after the last storm washed part of the road away, and he asked her how far she'd walked, whether she could see any landmarks, any lights at all, but she only sobbed harder and said the night was too dark, the wind too loud, and that she thought something was following her just beyond the sound of her own footsteps, a presence pacing her, never running, merely keeping time with the ache of her breath, and there was something in the way she spoke, clipped, desperate, almost apologetic, that stirred a memory of his own sister crying years ago when she had called him from the side of the road after her first accident, and maybe that was why he didn't hang up, why he swallowed the creeping unease tightening the back of his throat as he promised he'd try to find her, even though the road she described wasn't supposed to be accessible from the interstate at all, and he slowed the truck, scanning the desert. For the turnoff she mentioned, a narrow service lane barely visible beneath drifting sand, marked only by a rusted sign whose letters had long surrendered to the sun, and he felt the weight of the decision press against him like a hand urging him to turn back, yet he steadied the wheel and guided the truck toward the unmarked road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as if the ground were protesting his trespass, and when he glanced back at the phone to ask her to stay on the line, the call had already dropped, leaving only a dead silence that felt heavier than any voice, but before he had time to process that, a soft ping echoed through the cabin, a text message appearing despite the lack of signal, reading simply, keep going, I see your lights," and the words made the cabin feel instantly smaller, as though the darkness outside had shifted closer, listening, adjusting, and he looked ahead at the dim lane stretching into nowhere, noticing how the shape of the road changed subtly with each passing moment, bending not from terrain but from some quiet intention just beyond the reach of the headlights, and another message vibrated through his palm. Turn left at the tree with the broken top, and he felt his heartbeat falter. Because he had passed that exact tree only seconds earlier, a jagged, lightning-scarred stump jutting out of the sand like a snapped bone, and he wondered how she could have known that unless she was close enough to see him, close enough to watch his truck from somewhere just beyond the unlit horizon. Yet he saw no lights, no movement, nothing but the low shimmering haze of heat still radiating faintly from the ground even at this hour, and the sensation that someone was studying him, really studying him, settled over him with a coldness that had nothing to do with the desert air. But he drove on, guided not by the dim GPS that had frozen miles back but by the steady stream of silent instructions arriving in bursts of cold white text, each message describing something he would pass seconds before he saw it: a bullet-riddled sign leaning into the sand, a fence swallowed by shadows, a single shoe half buried at the roadside, each one too precise, too intimate, and each one making his palms sweat a little more as the old instinct to turn back clawed higher in his chest, but he fought it, focusing instead on the hope that he could help someone who sounded truly terrified, someone who might already be hurt, and he told himself that the desert was strange and unpredictable, that signals sometimes bounced off old towers in ways he didn't understand, that none of this meant danger was stalking him across the shifting sands. Yet every mile he drove made the night feel sharper. Around the edges, as if shaped by something with intent, and when the narrow road tightened into a single-lane path pressed between two low ridges, he slowed even further, headlights washing over rock carved with strange arcs and grooves that looked less like natural erosion and more like symbols worn down by time, and his phone buzzed again, this time with a message that read, "You're almost here, please hurry," and as he rolled forward, the engine's hum seemed to echo strangely, bouncing back at him as though the desert had suddenly sprouted unseen walls, and he rounded one final gentle bend expecting, hoping, to see the stranded woman or the wrecked car she had described, but instead the path dead-ended abruptly in a small clearing cut from the desert floor, and there was no car, no footprints, no sign of life anywhere, only a small, lonely roadside grave tilted slightly to one side, weathered and half swallowed by drifting sand, marked with a simple wooden cross that had cracked down the center like something long forgotten had tried to break free, and the silence that fell around him then was so total, so intentionally complete, that he felt a pulse of primal panic rise from somewhere deep inside him, and before he could shift the truck into reverse, before he could allow the rational part of his mind to catch up to the wrongness pressing against the windows, his phone lit up once more, vibrating violently against his palm, the screen flashing not unknown caller this time but a name he hadn't dialed and didn't recognize, a name he realized with a creeping horror wasn't a name at all but a place, Dead Man's Curve, and as the phone continued to vibrate, the vibration felt less like a call and more like something knocking from the inside, something impatient, hungry, and when he finally answered, the voice that met him was no longer sobbing, no longer pleading, but a low, cracked laughter that sounded like it came from the bottom of the ravine he knew lay somewhere beyond the desert's breadth, a laugh that seemed to ripple through the darkness and wrap itself around his throat with an awful familiarity, making him realize that whatever had reached out to him tonight had never needed saving, it had needed an audience, and he had driven straight into its waiting silence. Liam did not remember turning the truck around, only the sensation of the wheel sliding beneath his hands as though guided by something older than instinct, something lodged deep in that soft, trembling place behind the sternum where fear becomes momentum, and the tires spat sand as he reversed out of the clearing, the roadside grave shrinking in his mirror until it looked less like a memorial and more like an eye closing. But the desert didn't relax its grip on him, it felt as though the ridges on either side leaned inward, narrowing the path, reshaping themselves to slow his escape, and he kept glancing at the phone still glowing in the cup holder, the name Dead Man's Curve lingering on the cracked screen even though the call had ended, the icon showing 0 bars mocking him with its impossible persistence, and he told himself to breathe, told himself this was just exhaustion and the tricks of a desert night that swallowed sound and sense with equal hunger, yet the engine's hum sounded different now, less like machinery and more like a heartbeat that wasn't his, steady, insistent, echoing through the cabin in a way that made him tighten his grip on the wheel until his knuckles ached. and as he crawled back along the narrow cut between the ridges, he caught sight of something that shouldn't have been there. 3 sets of tire tracks etched into the sand ahead of him, running parallel to the path in the same direction he'd come from, tracks that looked fresh despite the drifting sands, faint but unmistakably recent, and he eased off the accelerator, staring at them because they didn't match his tires, didn't match any vehicle he had seen tonight, didn't match anything that should have been traveling this forgotten road at this hour, and a cold thought flickered through him. Maybe I wasn't the first one it called, but he pushed it away, swallowing the dryness scraping at the back of his throat as he focused on the road, willing the ridges to open back into desert plain. Yet each turn felt wrong, each bend unfamiliar even though he had just driven this stretch minutes ago, and he began counting the seconds between each landmark he thought he remembered, scarred rock, broken fence post, tree stump, but the landmarks came too quickly, clustered together like photographs shuffled out of order, and he whispered under his breath, "This isn't the same road." Though speaking the truth aloud made it feel heavier, more real, and as he drove on, the truck's headlights flickered, dimmed, then brightened again as though brushing against an unseen current, and the radio crackled to life even though he hadn't touched it, a faint static whisper rising like distant wind threading through old wires, but beneath that static came a tone, low, wavering, something like a woman humming through teeth clenched tight, and it was the same pitch, the same fractured rhythm he'd heard when the caller first sobbed on the line, and Liam reached forward to turn the radio off, but the dial resisted, stiff as though someone held it from the other side, and the static swelled into a swell of layered voices, not loud, not clear, but overlapping like a chorus lost in fog, whispering syllables that never quite formed words, and every hair along his arm stood straight as the truck rounded another bend and the desert seemed to lean closer, the ridges on either side rising higher though he could have sworn they had been lower before, and then the headlights washed over something small jutting from the sand ahead, a glint of metal catching the moonlight, and he slowed, heart dropping as he realized it was a crushed license plate, bent nearly in half buried as though pushed deliberately into the earth, the numbers worn and unreadable except for the last 3 digits, 315, and that struck him because it echoed the timestamp of the call he'd received, 3:15 a.m. And he thought, coincidence, but the desert didn't feel coincidental anymore, it felt like a script unfolding, and he drove on, gripping the wheel tighter as the radio fell suddenly silent again, leaving only the low hum of the engine and his own breath fogging slightly inside the cabin despite the desert heat, and his eyes darted to the mirrors, scanning for movement, because he couldn't shake the sense that somewhere behind him, or above him, something was pacing him, adjusting its rhythm to match the trucks as though studying him from a place just beyond visibility, and he forced his foot down harder on the accelerator, wanting nothing more than to reach the junction where this hidden lane met the interstate, but then another message pinged against the quiet, the phone vibrating with a dull, almost resentful buzz, and he hesitated before picking it up, the screen glowing with a new text, "You missed the turn, come back." And those 4 words made his chest tighten because there was no turn to miss, the road was a single twisting vein carved through stone, and while he stared at the message, another arrived immediately, as if correcting him, "Don't leave me here," and his pulse hammered as a third text blinked onto the screen. "You promised you'd help," and he whispered, "I didn't promise anything," but his voice sounded small, brittle, and he nearly dropped the phone when a 4th text arrived, "Yes, you did. When you answered." And that word, answered, struck him with the force of memory, because he thought of what old truckers sometimes muttered in late-night diners, those stories said half in jest about the desert's hitches, the echoes were shadows that called out to travelers asking for help they didn't need anymore, and how once you acknowledged them, even by a single word, they stayed with you, and he shook his head sharply because that was folklore, nothing more, yet the thought clung to him as the phone vibrated. Again, this time not with a text but a notification he shouldn't have been able to receive, voicemail received, 007, and he tapped it before he could talk himself out of it, pressing the phone to his ear as 7 seconds of sound spilled into him, breathing first, labored and close, then a faint scraping like fingernails dragging slowly across glass, and finally a single phrase whispered in a voice that was no longer the panicked woman from before but something deeper, older, worn by sand and distance. "Look behind you," and Liam froze, every muscle tightening as the words coiled through his spine, but he didn't look, he couldn't look, because something in that whisper carried the weight of inevitability, as though whatever waited for him in the mirror had been there long before he entered the desert tonight, and he forced the truck faster, engine groaning in protest as the ridges finally gave way to open plain once more. Yet the plain looked wrong too, the horizon too flat, the stars arranged in patterns he didn't recognize, and for a moment he wondered if he had somehow crossed into a place behind the desert, a place shaped by memory rather than geography, and the phone vibrated one last time as he neared what looked like the faint glow of the interstate, a final text appearing with the deliberate slowness of a hand tapping on glass. Almost there, don't look. Not yet, and he kept his eyes fixed on the faint stretch of highway ahead that shimmered like a promise, or a mirage, because something in him understood that looking back before he reached it would mean surrendering to whatever followed him, whatever had watched him drive deeper into its reach, and he whispered to himself, just get back to the main road, just get back, over and over like a mantra as the desert stretched and reshaped around him, and the moment his tires finally hit the familiar rumble strip at the junction, the radio fell instantly silent, the wind eased, and the desert exhaled as though disappointed to let him go. Yet as he merged onto the empty interstate, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the wheel, he couldn't help but glance at the mirror, unable to resist that small, fatal curiosity, and though he saw only darkness behind him, the phone buzzed one final time, a quiet, patient vibration, and when he lifted it with trembling fingers, the screen displayed a new map, one he had never downloaded, marked with a single blinking red point that pulsed like a heartbeat labeled simply, "You're not done." Liam drove for nearly 10 miles before he realized he hadn't breathed properly since reaching the interstate, each inhale thin and shaky, each exhale breaking against the tightness coiled beneath his ribs like a fist, and the desert around him no longer looked like the desert he'd known for years of long-haul routes. It felt stretched, diluted, the horizon too smooth, the road too clean, as if something had scrubbed the landscape of anything that could anchor him to reality, and he gripped the steering wheel harder, stealing glances at the phone lying face down in the cup holder, the glow pulsing faintly through the plastic like a trapped heartbeat, and he knew he should toss it out the window, let it vanish into the sand where no signal, natural or otherwise, could reach it, yet fear held him still, fear mixed with a strange, involuntary magnetism, as if the phone had become an extension of the night itself, and he didn't dare disrupt whatever fragile equilibrium kept his truck moving forward instead of being swallowed again by that impossible, shifting road, and the moment he reached for it, intending, if not to shut it off, at least to turn the screen away from him, the phone buzzed with a slow, deliberate vibration that felt more like a knock than an alert, and against every instinct screaming in the back of his mind, he turned it over, breath snagging as the screen lit with a notification he should never have been able to receive on an empty interstate at 3:42 a.m., new photo message received, and a thumbnail image blurred in the corner, too dark to decipher but clearly taken in low light, and more unsettling than the image itself was the sender, listed simply as no service, and he whispered, "No, no, no," but the words felt hollow, powerless against the weight of the silence pressing in around him as he tapped the message open, the photo expanding to fill the screen, and his stomach lurched violently because it was a picture of the back of his own truck, taken from somewhere just a few yards behind him, the taillights glowing dimly in the frame, and though the photo was grainy, the desert around his truck looked impossibly still, as if frozen mid-breath, and he forced himself to look away, turning the phone face down again as a cold sweat gathered at his hairline, but almost immediately the phone buzzed again, once, twice, a third time, each vibration growing sharper, more urgent, and he lifted it with trembling fingers to see 3 new messages arriving in rapid succession. "Don't slow down, you're not alone," and a final one that made his blood turn to ice. "Look closer at the picture." And the dread that had been simmering inside him began to climb, scraping at the inside of his spine with little hooks of cold panic, but curiosity, fatal, persistent, pushed at him, and he reopened the photo, enlarging it with his thumb even as his hand shook so badly it nearly slipped, and as he zoomed past the taillights, past the dusty bumper, his breath hitched because he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A faint distortion in the darkness, just at the edge of the frame, not quite a figure, not quite a shadow, but something with shape, a suggestion of shoulders, of a curve where a head might be, standing just off the road, watching the truck pass, and the moment he registered that shape, the photo seemed to glitch slightly, pixels swimming like disturbed sand before settling into a new configuration, revealing something worse, something unmistakable now, a pale outline of a hand pressed to the ground, as if someone had pushed themselves up from the earth, and he fumbled the phone, heart hammering as it clattered against the console, but it didn't fall far before another message appeared, this time not a text but an incoming call, the screen lighting up with an icon spinning slowly, almost hypnotically, showing the same label as before, Dead Man's Curve, and the call timer started immediately, automatically, without him touching anything, and he listened, breath trapped in his throat, as silence filled the line. Silence too perfect, too deliberate, a silence that carried weight, like someone waiting for him to speak first, and then, faintly, so faintly he almost dismissed it as engine noise, came a quiet scraping sound, like gravel shifting under a bare foot, followed by a whisper dragged across the line with an unsettling patience. "You left too soon," and Liam's grip tightened on the wheel because the voice wasn't the sobbing woman he'd heard earlier. This voice was layered, as though spoken by someone whose vocal cords hadn't been used in years. Brittle and dry, and beneath it lurked the faint echo of another voice, the same broken sobs from before, but flattened, hollow, like a recording played backward through sand, and he ended the call with a sharp tap, pulse racing, trying to steady himself with logic, reminding himself that technology glitches in the desert, that signals bounce in strange ways, that exhaustion can conjure hallucinations from static. But the lies tasted thin and metallic in his mouth because another message arrived. Immediately, this one a full voicemail transcript appearing without prompting. "I'm still here. You're still there. Come back." And something in the phrasing struck him, not threatening, not pleading, but stating, as if his return wasn't a request but an expectation, and the idea that he had been chosen, marked, settled into him like sand filling a footprint, and he told himself to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had threaded its voice through his phone. But the road ahead looked subtly wrong again, subtly bent, as if trying to curl back toward the desert, and the radio, silent since the clearing, began to hum with a low frequency that made the windows vibrate ever so slightly, and he could almost feel it in his teeth, a dull resonance that shifted in pitch as though aligning itself with the shape of his fear, and then the hum broke into faint murmurs, layered, rhythmic, almost conversational, and Liam realized with a chill that the voices weren't coming from the radio, they were coming from the phone. Speaker off, screen dark, yet still exhaling fragments of sound like breath slipping through a cracked door, and he grabbed it with both hands, ready to throw it out the window, but the screen lit up before he could, displaying a live map again, the red blinking point moving now, tracing a slow loop just behind his truck, and beneath the map, text appeared in a pulsing font, "Don't run. I'm following the right way," and that phrase, "the right way," lodged in his mind like a splinter, because he had heard stories years ago about travelers on this stretch of desert road who spoke of seeing doubles of themselves walking along the roadside, or hearing voices that sounded like their loved ones calling from old, dead numbers, and he'd always brushed them off as superstition, the kind of folklore that thrives in long-haul silence. But now he felt those stories tightening around him like a noose woven from sand and static, and as he stared at the phone, another photo arrived, auto-opening before he could block it, this time a picture of the inside of his truck, taken from the passenger seat, though he hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the truck shift, hadn't seen anything but the empty seat beside him, and in the grainy darkness of the photo, he could make out his own profile, illuminated by the dashboard's glow. But what froze him was not his own reflection, but the faint outline of someone sitting next to him, blurred, leaned forward, their face turned toward him as though whispering something he couldn't hear, and he stared so long his eyes began to water, breath locked in his chest, until the screen flickered, and another text arrived beneath the photo, "Now you see me," and the truck swerved slightly as terror punched through him, and he forced it back into the lane, knuckles white as bone, and he whispered, "This isn't real, this isn't real," but the desert didn't care about his denial, it simply listened, the way it always had, patient and ancient, and the phone buzzed again with one final message before the screen went black, a message that made the world tilt in on itself with a slow, crushing inevitability. Next stop, the grave. Liam didn't remember making a conscious decision to slow down, yet at some point after the final message, next stop, the grave. His foot eased off the accelerator as though responding not to fear but to a command woven into the very texture of the night, and the truck drifted along Interstate 99 in a long, uneasy glide, the white lane markers slipping past like chalk lines drawn to measure the distance between heartbeat and panic, and for the first time since escaping the dirt road he felt something shifting in the air around him. A change so subtle it might have been temperature or pressure or simply the desert inhaling, preparing itself, and the radio, which had fallen silent after that strange harmonic hum, cracked faintly again, not music, not voices this time, but the sound of distant wind hitting a microphone, a hollow, empty rush that seemed to deepen the longer he listened, as though the desert itself had found a way to exhale through the speakers, and every few seconds, beneath that wind, came a soft popping sound, rhythmic, as if pebbles were being tossed one by one at a sheet of metal. Somewhere in the dark, and he forced his eyes forward, refusing to glance at the passenger seat even though the memory of that blurred figure from the photo clung to him like static electricity riding up the back of his neck, yet the longer he tried not to look, the stronger the compulsion became, rising like an itch under the skin, until eventually he flicked his gaze sideways just once, fast, almost accidental, and felt cold cascade through his chest because although the seat was empty now, the indentation on the cushion was unmistakably fresh, as if someone had just stood up and stepped out into the night without using the door, and he gripped the wheel tighter, nails digging into the leather as a tremor went through him, and he whispered to himself that he needed to stop, needed to breathe, needed to think, but the desert had never been kind to hesitation, and the moment he eased his foot toward the brake pedal the phone vibrated violently in the cup holder, the screen igniting with a red flashing notification labeled Detour activated, and the GPS, dead since hours ago, rerouted itself with a cold mechanical precision, drawing a thick crimson line that snaked off the interstate toward a branching road Liam knew shouldn't exist anywhere near here, a road that arced rightward into darkness before looping sharply like a hooked finger pointing back to the desert's ribcage, and beneath the map, written in small, patient text as though someone had leaned close to whisper it into the software, he read, "Don't stop on the highway, you'll want witnesses. You won't get any," and a numbness crept over him because the message felt more like prophecy than threat, and a tremor ran along his jaw as he shook his head and muttered, "No. No, I'm done. I'm done with this," but the night absorbed his words without echo, without acknowledgement, as though the very act of defiance meant nothing, and when he pressed the brakes harder, intending to pull over and abandon everything, truck, phone, route, there was a sound he had never heard in all his years of driving, a soft metallic click, not from the engine but from below him, as though something deep in the undercarriage had locked into place, preventing him from stopping, and he pumped the brakes frantically, but the pedals stiffened under his foot, resisting him with a quiet stubbornness, and the truck continued moving steadily forward, matching the pace of the glowing red line pulsing on the screen, and he felt a pulse of terror bloom behind his sternum because this was no longer coincidence or glitch or exhaustion. This was a path being chosen for him, drawn out by something with intent, and the radio wind grew louder as the interstate exit he did not remember ever seeing appeared. Ahead, illuminated only by the thin sweep of his headlights, and the sign, rusted, sun-bleached, the letters nearly gone, tilted like a tired sentinel at the edge of the road, but he could still make out the faint impression of words carved decades ago, Dead Man's Curve, 2 miles, and the sight of that name on an actual physical sign felt wrong, impossibly wrong, because this was a legend among truckers, not a place that appeared on maps or mile markers. It was something whispered about at rest. Stops in the same tone used for ghost sightings or strange things in the desert heat, and yet here it was, pointing him down a narrow asphalt strip that curved abruptly out of sight, flanked by rocks that looked like crouched figures waiting for him to cross their threshold, and the truck turned toward it smoothly, obediently, his hands still on the wheel yet no longer guiding it, and he whispered, "Don't do this," voice cracking under the strain of terror, but the truck didn't care, or perhaps listened to something else entirely, and as they left the interstate behind, the desert air grew colder, heavy with the metallic tang of imminent storm despite the cloudless sky, and the moon dimmed slightly, as though veiled by something he couldn't see, and the headlights flickered as if passing through a veil of static rather than dust, and the road narrowed further until he could see only 10 feet ahead, and the rocks on either side seemed to lean inward, creating a corridor that funneled him deeper with every second, and the phone buzzed once more, a single long vibration that felt like a hand gripping his wrist, and the screen lit with a single message, "You're back," and his breath caught because he had not wanted to be here, had fought not to be here, yet something had guided him, shaped his decisions, softened his grip, muddled his mind until the road itself felt like a suggestion whispered too close to his ear. And the truck crept forward until another sign appeared, this one shattered into two jagged pieces at its base, each half bearing part of a painted sentence, slow and curve, and he felt nausea coil inside him because the stories he had heard about Dead Man's Curve were always the same, a road that twisted too sharply, a drop too steep, a guardrail too flimsy, and drivers who took the turn and never made it out, their cars found days later at the bottom of the ravine, doors flung open as if they had tried to climb out at the moment of impact, and he imagined the sound of metal shearing against rock, the way headlights would swing like dying stars as the vehicle tumbled, and before he could stop himself, he whispered, "Is that what you want?" Though he didn't know who he was speaking to, the phone, the voice, the desert, or something older than all three, and the answer came in the form of a soft tapping against the passenger side window, a slow, deliberate pattern like knuckles brushing glass from the outside, though when he forced himself to look, there was nothing but the desert pressed against the window, unchanged and unmoving, yet the tapping continued, shifting to the back window. Then the driver's side, circling him with patient persistence, as though whatever walked with him had long since abandoned the need for a human voice, and the truck rounded a gentle bend that deepened into a sharper one, the asphalt beginning to tilt ever so slightly toward a dark stretch of nothingness on the right, and the headlights caught the faint shimmer of a guardrail, old, bent, torn open at the center as though something had burst through it from the inside rather than crashed into it from the road, and the moment the light touched it, the radio snapped to life with a jagged burst of sound, not wind this time but a woman's voice screaming a single word, "Stop," but the command came a fraction too late, because the truck surged forward with a sudden lurch as if shoved, and the wheels skidded dangerously close to the crumbling edge, the ravine yawning below like a mouth waiting to swallow everything. Truck, driver, heartbeat, breath. And for one suspended instant Liam felt the weightlessness of inevitability, the moment where fate chooses direction, but then the truck jerked violently left, as if yanked by something unseen, and he gasped as the tires regained traction, the nose of the truck swinging back into the center of the curve, and he realized with a sickening lurch that the thing controlling this night didn't want him to die, not yet, and the phone lit again, screen flickering through static before stabilizing on a single sentence. "Not the grave. Not yours." And below those words, the map reappeared, the red line ending in a blinking dot not far ahead, labeled simply, "Arrival." The blinking red dot on the map pulsed with a slow, almost living rhythm as Liam approached it, the truck crawling forward as though every rotation of the tires required negotiation with something unseen, and the ravine to his right narrowed into a thin, jagged mouth before disappearing behind a rise in the terrain, leaving him in a shallow bowl of desert where the air felt unnaturally still, as if the sky itself were holding its breath while waiting for him to arrive, and the truck finally rolled to a stop, this time not forced, not resisted, but settling with a quiet shudder that felt eerily organic, like an animal tensing after a long journey, while the headlights illuminated a small clearing framed by crumbling rocks whose shadows stretched unnaturally long for a night with such a thin moon, and in the center of that clearing stood a single wooden roadside cross, weathered, crooked, unmistakably the same one he'd seen earlier on that impossible dirt road, except now the grave marker was fully exposed, no longer half swallowed by sand but standing as though the earth had deliberately pushed it upward to make room for something beneath, and as he stared at it, the radio went dead silent, so silent it almost rang in his ears, as if the night had stripped itself of sound to make space for what came next, and the phone buzzed once, softly, almost tenderly, before lighting up with a new message. "We're here." And he felt a tremor spread slowly through his chest, a cold understanding that the pronoun wasn't singular, that whatever had called him had never been alone, and he whispered to himself, "No. I'm leaving," gripping the wheel with trembling fingers, but when he tried to shift the truck into reverse the gear lever refused to move, as though welded into place by the thick, breathless darkness pressing at the windows, and he reached for the ignition, ready to force the engine off, but before his hand even touched the key the phone lit again, displaying a second message, "Don't go yet. She wants to see you." And those words carried a weight that felt older than fear, a weight shaped by grief or memory or something trying too hard to mimic those things, and he stared at them until his vision blurred, the tendons in his neck pulled taut as he glanced toward the grave illuminated in the headlights, and for a heartbeat, just one, he thought he saw movement beside it, a small slump of shadow straightening slightly like someone pushing themselves upright after kneeling too long, but When he blinked, the shape was gone, leaving only the crooked cross leaning toward him like an invitation carved by loneliness and desperation, and the phone buzzed again, showing not a message this time but a voicemail notification. 12 seconds. And the timestamp sent a tremor through him because it was marked yesterday, though the call itself hadn't existed until now, and despite every instinct screaming for him to ignore it, to drive until the tank ran dry, he pressed play, bringing the phone slowly to his ear, and for the first 3 seconds there was only static, thick and grainy like sand pouring over stone, but then beneath it he heard breathing, shallow and uneven, followed by a voice, her voice, the woman from before, whispering his name in a tone that carried a strange mixture of relief and resentment. Liam, you came back, and he felt something inside him twist because he had never told her his name, yet she spoke it with the familiarity of someone who had practiced it for years, someone who had waited for its sound to break silence again, and the voicemail continued, I tried to leave. I tried to go home. But the road only goes one way now, and then a low scraping sound filled the line, as though fingers were dragging across stone, and her voice lowered to a trembling whisper, you weren't supposed to answer the first time. You were supposed to be asleep, and before he could pull the phone away the voicemail cut off with a sharp click, leaving a dead, airless silence in which his own heartbeat sounded like something trying to claw its way out of him, and he dropped the phone into the passenger seat, each breath tighter than the one before as he stared straight ahead at the grave until the edges of the world seemed to blur, and he whispered, what do you want from me? Though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the woman, the voice that had replaced her, or the desert that had swallowed both, and the answer came almost immediately, not through the phone, not through the radio, but through the ground itself, a soft tremor that made the rocks shift and the headlights flicker, and he watched in paralyzed disbelief as the sand in front of the grave began to rise in slow, uneven swells, as though something buried beneath was pushing upward with weak, exhausted hands, and the tremor deepened, becoming a faint thudding rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat laboring after long silence, and then the sand split, just slightly, and a breath of cold air escaped from the earth, fogging in the beams of his headlights despite the desert heat, and he felt his entire body lock when the phone vibrated one more time with a new message that appeared without a sender. I can't get out. Help me. And the moment he read those words, the sand shifted again and something pale broke the surface for a second, a glimpse of bone. Knuckle? No, a corner of a phone, its cracked screen reflecting his headlights before sinking again as though pulled back by unseen fingers. And the realization struck him with a cold that felt like drowning. Someone else had been called here before, maybe countless someones, each pulled toward this place by a voice that seemed fragile, desperate, human, each arriving to the same grave, each trying to help, each leaving part of themselves buried here whether they survived the night or not, and the desert trembled again, stronger this time, and the phone glowed with another message, the words shifting like heat mirage, I'm still here. So are you. And suddenly he understood, not fully, not in a way he could articulate, but in the deep, instinctive way animals understand the scent of fire, that this wasn't about rescuing a stranded woman or confronting a haunting, but about continuation, about the desert claiming witnesses the way it claimed roads and guardrails and lost headlights, and he leaned forward, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched, whispering, I'm not staying, though he knew promises meant nothing. Here. And he slammed his foot onto the accelerator with a desperation that tore something in his throat, and this time, this single time, the truck responded, lurching backward, engine screaming as though ripped from a net, and the headlights swung wildly across the clearing, throwing frantic shadows that twitched like startled creatures retreating into stone, and he reversed so sharply the tires skidded through loose sand. Yet he didn't dare look away from the road as he swung the truck around and thundered back toward the curve, engine howling as if pursued, and though he expected the phone to scream, to vibrate, to flash with command after command, it remained dark now, silent and heavy like something unconscious, or watching, yet the radio crackled back to life with a faint, broken voice whispering through waves of static, you can run, but the road remembers, and he drove faster, faster, until the truck burst back onto Interstate 99 with a jolt that felt like breaking through a skin stretched across reality, and the desert air warmed abruptly, the moon brightened, and the horizon regained its familiar shape, yet Liam didn't stop until dawn began bleeding into the sky, painting the asphalt in long streaks of pale gold that felt almost like absolution, and he finally pulled into a rest stop he'd used dozens of times before, hands trembling so badly he could barely shift into park. And he sat there for a long time with the truck idling beneath him, feeling the exhaustion crash over him in slow, choking waves. But when he finally gathered the strength to reach for the phone, intending to turn it off and maybe throw it away for good, he discovered the screen was shattered down the center, a perfect split like someone had pressed their thumb into the glass from the inside, and yet despite the cracks, one notification blinked steadily at the top with impossible clarity. One missed call, dead man's curve, 6:12 a.m., and below it a single text appeared, time-stamped. For minutes into the future, its letters dissolving slowly as though written on fogged glass. You helped me get out. Now it's your turn. The reflection pass. The fog began swallowing the road long before Hale Carrington reached the first incline of Oakhaven Pass, a living, breathing curtain of white that rolled across the asphalt like something drawn upward from the forest floor, thick enough that her headlights pierced only a narrow tunnel through it, a damp and shifting cone of light that trembled each time her tires hit a crack in the pavement, and she kept leaning forward in the driver's seat as though her body could will more visibility into existence, squinting through the wavering haze that pressed gently against the windshield and softened every tree, every guardrail, every curve into ghostly silhouettes that seemed to appear too late and disappear too quickly. And somewhere beneath the hum of the engine she could hear the faint hiss of moisture sliding down the glass, a sound like quiet breathing, steady, patient, almost syncing with her own, and Hale rolled the window down a few inches, hoping a rush of cold air might wake her from the clouded exhaustion that had settled behind her eyes during the long drive from Portland, the wind carrying with it the biting scent of pine needles and wet soil, as if the forest exhaled directly into the cabin, heavy and mineral and strangely metallic in the back of her throat, and she told herself it was nothing, just a long day, too little sleep, too many hours of studying before deciding to leave campus on a whim to surprise her parents before midterms, but her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel when she noticed how the fog didn't swirl with the wind but instead pressed flat against the car window, sliding downward in slow streaks like fingertips tracing the glass, and she found herself glancing at the reflections scattered across the interior, the faint white glow reflected in the dashboard, the warped shapes in the side mirror, the cold glimmer along the chrome edges of the gear shift, and something about the silence of the pass unnerved her more than the darkness ever had, a silence so complete it felt curated, as if the forest had drawn a thick blanket over itself to listen, truly listen, as her car crawled through its untouched hours, and she whispered, "It's just fog," though the words fell flat, absorbed by the air before they reached her own ears, and she took a slow breath as she rounded a shallow curve, the road barely visible under the swirl of silver-white vapor. And that was when she saw it, just a flicker, barely a silhouette. Reflected in the passenger side window, a human figure standing so close to the glass it seemed their breath should fog it, though there was no warmth, no sound, nothing but the unmistakable shape of a shoulder, the slope of a head bowed slightly toward her, and Hale's heart lurched as she snapped her gaze away from the reflection to the empty passenger seat, cold air stinging her cheek where she had reflexively recoiled, and there was no one there. Of course there was no one there, just the faint scent of pine and the yawning quiet of the mountain, but the reflection, she had seen something, hadn't she? And she forced herself to exhale, telling herself it was a trick of the fog, a trick of the light, a trick of her exhausted mind weaving shapes out of wet glass and scattered glare, yet as she continued driving she couldn't shake the sensation that the figure hadn't been vague or shapeless like most illusions. It had felt solid, present, as though someone had been pacing the car, keeping stride with her movement, visible only in the brief, slanted angle of reflection when moisture caught the light just right, and she tried to laugh under her breath but the sound came out thin and hollow as she adjusted the mirror, swallowing the knot forming at the base of her throat, and she kept her eyes fixed on the road even as her peripheral vision tugged at her, urging her to look again, to confirm or deny the thing her mind insisted had been there, but she refused, leaning forward even more as the fog thickened to the point that the guardrails vanished entirely, swallowed by white, and the absence of physical boundaries made her chest tighten because the road now felt less like a path and more like a floating strip suspended between worlds, anchored only by the narrow reach of her headlights, and she whispered, "Just a little farther," but the fog became denser still, as if responding to her voice, coiling inward until the windshield resembled frosted glass, faint shapes drifting across it with patterns reminiscent of footprints smudging the surface from the outside, and she shivered, rolling the window back up as the cold became more invasive, curling around her wrists and sinking into the back of her spine like a damp hand, and that was when she saw the figure again, not outside this time, but in the faint line of the rear-view mirror, the reflection trembling slightly from the vibrations of the car yet unmistakably human, positioned exactly where a passenger would sit if they existed only in the realm of reflection, and Hale's pulse spiked as she stared at the mirror, her breath caught in her throat because the figure wasn't sitting back in the seat but leaning forward, angled toward her, their head tilted with an unnatural stillness that suggested both curiosity and intent, and she turned instinctively to look back at the actual seat, willing her body to move despite the fear locking her ribs in place, and of course the seat was empty, but the reflection hadn't lied. It showed someone there, someone who wasn't in the car but somehow occupied the space between her vision and the glass, and she gasped softly, gripping the wheel as the road narrowed into a tight curve scraping dangerously close to the mountainside, and the fog outside shimmered with a faint, pulsing glow, as though it carried its own internal light, and she whispered, "I'm imagining this. I have to be," because the alternative clawed at her mind with cold fingers, suggesting that the reflections weren't tricks at all but glimpses of something real, something that existed only in mirrored surfaces because that was the only place it was allowed to be, the only place it could manifest in this world, and as she straightened the wheel, desperate to regain control of her spiraling thoughts, she caught movement on the windshield, right in front of her, not in the rearview mirror this time, but in the fog-polished glass itself, a figure leaning close from the outside, a head, a blurred face pressed to the window as though trying to peer inside, and she gasped, jerking the wheel, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt before catching again, the reflection vanishing instantly as though the figure had dissolved into the fog, and Hale forced her breath out in rapid bursts, her chest tightening painfully, and the forest around her seemed to lean closer, the fog folding in layers that looked disturbingly like fabric being drawn across a face, and she whispered, "Please stop," though she didn't know if she meant the fog, the fear, or whatever presence kept appearing in the reflections, and she considered pulling over, but where, because the shoulder was barely visible, and who could she call, because there was no service sign blinking mockingly in the corner of her screen, and the idea of stopping, of allowing the fog to fully envelop her car, made her stomach twist as though something in the night waited for stillness the same way a spider waits for the vibration of a web, and she pressed on, knuckles white, body taut, and as the incline steepened the glow of her headlights caught a patch of exposed rock dripping with moisture, the droplets catching the light like tiny eyes watching her, and the rearview mirror flickered again, the reflection shifting in a way she couldn't rationalize, the figure now closer, more defined, a hint of flannel on the shoulder, a faint outline of a jaw too pale to belong to anyone living, and Hale felt something inside her crack, not a scream, not panic, but a quiet, devastating understanding that she was no longer driving alone, and had not been for several miles, and the realization made the fog seem thicker, denser, as though responding to her awareness by closing in protectively around the presence riding in the reflections, and when she reached forward to adjust the radio, hoping for anything, any sound to break the suffocating silence, the glass of the windshield shifted subtly, not physically but optically, bending light in a way that made the reflection of the passenger seat sharpen, as though something on the other side had leaned closer to the glass to ensure she noticed it, and she saw the figure again, clearer this time, shoulders angled forward, head tilted almost affectionately, the position too still to be human, too patient, and Hale squeezed her eyes shut for one dangerous second before forcing them open, needing to see the road, needing to keep moving, because stopping now felt like an invitation she could never take back, and she kept driving, her breath shaking, her vision trembling at the edges as Oakhaven Pass swallowed her deeper into its quiet, fog-choked throat, and somewhere in the mirror a shape waited, riding in silence, its presence growing more confident, more anchored, as if the reflections were slowly ceasing to be reflections at all. The higher Hale Carrington climbed into Oakhaven Pass, the more the fog began to feel less like weather and more like a presence, an entity with weight and intention, rolling in slow, thick currents around the car as though studying her movements with a curious patience, and she kept wiping the windshield even though the wipers accomplished nothing, the moisture smearing instead of clearing, creating long, streaked trails that made the glass resemble a pane someone had dragged their fingers across from the outside, tracing hesitant shapes that dissolved as soon as she noticed them, and she swallowed hard, leaning forward to focus on the faint sliver of road ahead, because the pass had become so narrow now that even a slight drift left or right felt like it might launch her off the mountain or scrape her alongside a rocky wall that the fog kept mercifully out of sight, and beneath the drone of the engine she thought she heard something else. A rhythm, soft and uneven, almost like footsteps pacing her speed, keeping time with each curve of the road, yet whenever she slowed even a fraction, the sound stopped instantly, as if the one walking beside her paused to listen, to mimic her hesitation before resuming with the exact cadence of her acceleration, and the knowledge that something outside the car might be matching her pace made her throat tighten until she could barely breathe, but she refused to glance at the window again, refused to risk seeing another distorted profile pressed to the fog-lit glass, so instead she tried to focus on her hands, on the motion of her fingers gripping the wheel, on the steady rhythm of her breath, until she caught the faintest shimmer of movement in the rearview mirror and instinct yanked her gaze upward before she could stop herself, and there he was again, that vague figure sitting in the reflection of the passenger seat, and though he remained indistinct, made of fog and fractured light, he seemed clearer than before. Less like a trick of illumination and more like something negotiating its way into her world, his posture subtly different now, not leaning forward but turned slightly toward her, as though he had adjusted himself to better study her expression, and she swallowed a trembling breath, her fingers tightening on the wheel until her knuckles burned, because she could see the suggestion of hair, short and uneven like it had grown wild. She could make out the faint outline of a coat collar, old-fashioned, frayed along the edges, and something about the details felt wrong, as if the reflection were reconstructing itself from memory or from some incomplete understanding of humanity, approximating the shape of a man rather than truly being one, and Hale whispered, "Go away," barely audible even to herself, but the instant the words escaped her lips, the headlights flickered and the figure in the mirror tilted his head. Not fast, not aggressive, but slowly, the movement deliberate and eerily curious, like an animal hearing its name for the first time, and she jerked her eyes back to the road, heart thundering hard enough that she felt it in her fingertips, because the fog ahead had thickened into a wall that absorbed her headlights completely, leaving her driving into what felt like a blank surface, and for a moment she was certain she had entered a space with no depth at all, as if the world had pressed flat around her, and she would simply collide into darkness and vanish. But then the fog receded by only a few feet, creating a narrow corridor of visibility that felt less natural and more like an invitation, or a trap, guiding her forward, and she wanted so desperately to stop the car, to climb into the back seat and curl up until the sun rose, but some instinct whispered that stopping would be worse, far worse, that whatever watched her from the reflections would take her stillness as permission, and she forced herself to continue, even as the road curved sharply, hugging the mountainside so closely she could almost feel the cold stone lurking on the other side of the fog, and she whispered, "Just a little longer," her breath fogging in the cabin though the heater had been on for the past hour, and that was when she heard it, clearer this time, a faint tapping from the passenger side, rhythmic, gentle, not quite human yet unmistakably intentional, and the tapping grew slightly firmer, like someone adjusting their hand placement, and she held her breath as the fog on the window thickened in a small, distinct shape, as though a palm were pressing into it from the other side. The outline smudging and dragging as if searching for the right angle to see her through the glass, and her pulse hammered so violently she felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to look directly at the smear forming on the window, refusing to confirm what every instinct screamed was there, and the tapping suddenly stopped, the silence thick and sudden enough to make her flinch, but then she heard breathing, soft, shallow, coming from too close, drifting across the cabin in a way that didn't match her own, as if the fog itself had shaped a mouth and lungs solely to mimic life beside her, and she choked back a cry as she tightened her grip until she feared she might tear the wheel free from its mount, and she whispered again, go away," but her voice wavered, betraying her terror, and in the rearview mirror the figure shifted, actually shifted, not a trick of motion or vibration this time but a purposeful movement, shoulders rising as though he were inhaling for the first time in years, head lifting just enough that she could see the faint pale blur of what might have been a face, and she caught the faint curve of a cheek, a hollow where a temple should be, and she felt rooted to the seat, unable to tear her gaze away from the mirror even as logic screamed at her to look at the road, yet the fog split suddenly ahead, revealing a straight stretch of asphalt, and she took the opportunity, forcing herself to break eye Contact, jerking her attention forward just as the figure leaned another inch toward her in the reflection, and her breath came out in a rush, tight and panicked, but she pressed the accelerator, needing distance, any distance, between herself and the shifting shapes behind her, and the engine roared louder than she'd intended, echoing off unseen stone walls, but the sound gave her something tangible to cling to, a noise so forceful it felt capable of cutting through the fog, suffocating. Silence, yet as the car surged forward she saw movement again, not behind her this time, but beside her, reflected faintly in the fog swirling beyond the passenger window, a human-shaped blur running parallel to the car, matching her acceleration step for step, its form shimmering as though made of darkness and condensed air, and she heard a faint drag, like fingertips brushing against metal, keeping pace with her speed, and her vision blurred with tears as she whispered, "Please stop, please stop." But the shape outside the window only grew clearer, its reflection sharpening in the glass even though nothing physical occupied the space outside, and Hale felt something in her mind tilt, as though the border between reflection and reality had thinned into a membrane that the figure was slowly, deliberately pressing against, and then, just as her fear tipped into something close to panic, the road straightened slightly, widening enough to reveal the faint glow of a turnout up ahead, a little gravel shoulder carved into the mountainside where motorists could pull over, and though stopping felt like stepping into a trap, continuing felt worse, because she no longer trusted the reflections to remain in the glass, and with her heart clawing into her throat she eased toward the turnout, tires crunching against gravel as the car slowed, and for an instant hope flickered through her chest, thin, fragile, until she realized the fog outside was pooling unnaturally around the passenger side, a thick wave of white rising like a wall, and in that clouded surface she saw the faint outline of a person. Standing inches from the glass, head bowed, shoulders slumped forward the way a puppet hangs in its strings, and though she refused to look directly at him, the mirror betrayed her, revealing the figure in perfect clarity, now fully seated in the passenger seat reflection, hands folded neatly in his lap as though waiting for her to acknowledge him, and she couldn't help it. She gasped and turned her head slightly, terrified but desperate to confirm that the seat was empty, and it was, mercifully. But the moment she looked back at the mirror the figure had leaned closer still, fog clustering around the shape of his face, and this time she saw eyes, pale, hollow, like the last bit of moonlight before morning tears it away, and she slammed her foot onto the accelerator, gravel spitting violently behind her as the car surged back onto the narrow road, the reflection recoiling slightly before returning to the exact same place, patient, unbothered, and she whispered through clenched teeth, "I need to get out of this pass," but the fog did not thin, did not break, and she realized with a sinking dread that whatever followed her was no longer content to linger in the reflections. It was learning, adjusting, understanding her fear, and preparing for the moment it would no longer need the glass at all. Hale Carrington had never been afraid of silence before tonight, but the silence inside Oakhaven Pass felt like something carefully prepared, as though the mountain itself had hollowed out a chamber of quiet just to cradle her fear, and as she sped away from the turnout her pulse hammered hard enough that she could feel it reverberating in her wrists, a desperate rhythm that failed to drown out the faint but unmistakable sound of breathing that drifted from somewhere it should never have been. From the reflections, from the fog, from the space just beyond her peripheral vision where the world felt thin and stretched, and she kept her eyes locked on the winding road even as the rearview mirror tugged at her attention like a hand curling its fingers under her chin, urging her to look, to acknowledge the figure still seated in that impossible place, and she whispered, "No, no, not looking, not looking," her voice trembling as she forced her foot down harder on the accelerator, but the fog tightened again, shrinking into a narrow, suffocating tunnel of dim light that seemed to tear every sound apart except for the ones meant for her, and when the reflection moved, actually moved, the shift was so slight she almost missed it, a subtle tilt of the head or an adjustment of the shoulders, but it was enough to summon a cold, spreading dread that crawled along her ribs, because reflections weren't supposed to move independently. They weren't supposed to anticipate her, they weren't supposed to breathe, and she felt it again, that faint exhale drifting lightly against her ear despite the fact that the cabin remained still, windows sealed, air unmoving, and she clamped her jaw shut to keep from crying out, fingers trembling on the wheel as the curve ahead tightened, a sharp bend that dove into a pocket of fog so dense it resembled a wall of white stone, and just as she began to turn into it the mirror flickered, not from vibration or light but from something deliberate, as If someone had brushed a hand across its surface from the inside, smearing the reflection for a heartbeat before it snapped back into focus, and now there were two shapes seated in the reflection, one in the passenger seat where the original figure had been, leaning closer than ever, almost close enough that the curve of his cheek intersected with the outline of her shoulder, and another shape behind her, sitting directly in the back seat, its head bowed forward as though listening to every unsteady breath she exhaled, and Hale's throat tightened so violently she nearly choked, every muscle in her neck screaming at her to look back and confirm that the rear seats were empty, but she knew, God, she knew, that looking would give the reflections more than her attention, it would give them permission, and the fog outside pulsed faintly, as though approving her fear, brightening once, then dimming in a steady rhythm that made the entire pass feel alive, breathing, watching, and in the rear-view mirror the figure in the back lifted his head for the first time, slow and stiff, revealing not a face but a pale smear of features, as though the fog had begun molding itself into the memory of a person whose identity had long since rotted away, and Hale pressed the accelerator so hard the car lurched, tires skidding dangerously along the slick asphalt before catching again, and she swallowed a sob that rose in her chest like a knot of burning air, whispering, "Please stop, please. Stop." But the reflections did not stop. They seemed to grow more confident, unfolding themselves as though the fog had sculpted limbs and torsos and the suggestion of old clothing, lumberjack flannel, worn denim, the kind of attire that looked torn from a life spent in the Oregon wilderness decades ago, and the figure in the passenger reflection pressed a hand against the glass of the mirror, its fingers elongating slightly, stretching as though the boundary between reflection and reality was thinning, weakening, eroding under the weight of the fog's will, and Hale jerked the wheel slightly, panic tightening every joint as a small clearing appeared up ahead, revealed briefly by a thinning swirl of mist, and she realized with a sinking dread that the clearing wasn't a safe stretch of road, but a turnout where a decaying wooden sign stood half buried in mud, carved with words she could barely make out through the dark, Oakhaven Memorial Lookout, and beneath it, a spray-painted message that made her stomach twist violently. The mirrors keep what the mountain loses, and for a fraction of a second she saw other vehicles in the fog-drenched clearing, the husks of cars left abandoned, doors gaping open, headlights long dead, their windshields shattered inward as though something had crawled through the glass rather than smashed it, and she swerved sharply back onto the main path, refusing to stop, refusing to let the mountain or the fog or whatever hunted her claim her the way it had claimed the others. But the moment she realigned her wheels the rear-view mirror flickered again, a violent, static-like glitch that made her vision blur for a heartbeat, and when it cleared the figures were closer, impossibly closer, their forms more detailed now, as though each mile she drove strengthened them, sharpened them, fed them, and the passenger reflection's face finally solidified enough for her to make out the features, pale skin stretched too tightly over the cheekbones, lips cracked and colorless, eyes sunken yet gleaming faintly like wet river stones buried under ice, and he smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that climbed one side of his face before the other caught up, the motion disjointed, like someone remembering how to mimic joy, and Hale's vision swam with fear as she whispered, "Don't look at him, just don't look," but her gaze was drawn to the mirror anyway, pulled by some terrible gravity, and the figure in the back seat leaned forward, his face now close enough to her reflected shoulder that she could see the faint impression of old scars carved across what should have been skin, scars arranged in lines, almost vertical, almost like cracks, like fractures in glass, and she understood with a sudden, nauseating clarity that the figures weren't entirely human, weren't entirely anything. They were shapes whispered into being by the mountain, by the fog, by whatever had been watching every traveler who drove into its grasp, shaping itself from the memories of those who had looked too long into the mirrors, those who had given the reflections their fear, their attention, their acknowledgement, because the reflection could only grow when seen, and Hale jerked her eyes away from the mirror, biting down on her trembling lips so hard she tasted iron mixed with the cold air, and the fog outside thickened once more, funneling her deeper into the narrowing pass, and she whispered, almost out, though she had no idea how far the end was, if it even existed anymore, or if the mountain was simply looping her through the same cursed space again and again, reshaping each curve to keep her trapped, and the figure in the mirror tilted his head again, lips parting as if preparing to speak, the fog swelling outward from the reflection's mouth like breath condensing on cold air, and though no sound emerged, Hale felt the meaning as clearly as if it had been whispered into her ear. "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time her fears sharpened into something else. Not quite anger, not quite resolve, but a refusal, a thin spark of self-preservation that cut through the fog, drowning her mind, and she gripped the wheel so tightly the leather creaked beneath her fingers, whispering through clenched teeth, "You're not real," though she felt the lie tremble in her voice, and the reflections smiled wider, as if amused by her denial, as if they had been told the same thing by countless others who had not survived the pass. And the fog outside pulsed again, and the glass of the windshield bowed inward by a hair, barely visible, but enough to tell her the reflections were no longer content to remain in the mirror, no longer content to be mere observers, and the road ahead bent sharply downward into a curve that felt too tight, too deliberate, and she realized with crushing dread that the mountain was guiding her toward something, toward someone, toward whatever final form these reflections wanted her to see face to face, unmediated by glass, and she whispered, breath-breaking, "I have to get out," not knowing whether she meant the pass or the car or the nightmare pressing its cold breath across her skin, and the reflection of the man in the passenger seat blinked for the very first time, slow, deliberate, and murmured something she couldn't hear but felt in the marrow of her bones, a message that traveled across the fog, across the mirror, into her without sound at all. "There's more than one of us." The road began to drop more steeply as Hale Carrington descended deeper into Oakhaven Pass, the asphalt sloping downward in a way that felt less like a natural mountain road and more like a chute carved intentionally to funnel her into whatever waited in the fog-thick valley below, and the reflection of the man beside her, no, the imitation of a man, sat unerringly still in the mirror, as though bracing himself for arrival, the smile curling slowly along his pale reflection face, widening by degrees each time her heartbeat spiked, and she could feel it, actually feel his awareness threading through the thin membrane of glass, his presence growing heavier as the fog outside thickened into a churning mass that writhed against the car windows like a living tide, and she forced her eyes away from the mirror for as long as she could, focusing instead on the narrowing asphalt that flickered in and out of sight beneath her headlights. But the fog distorted even that, bending the beams into strange angles that made the road appear to ripple, stretching or contracting like breathing flesh, and she whispered to herself that she just needed to make it out of the pass, that somewhere beyond this suffocating corridor of white the world still followed its normal rules. But as she drove on, her thoughts trailed into static, dissolving into the same faint hiss that now seeped from the air vents despite the fan being off, and she reached to turn the radio on just to drown it out, but the moment her fingers brushed the dial, the speakers erupted with a sharp, crackling burst, like glass snapping underwater, followed by a low voice that did not speak words but exhaled, long and drawn out, the kind of breath someone makes when they press their face so close to a mirror they can feel its cold surface against their skin, and Hale yanked her hand back as though burned, heart racing as the voice faded into a soft chorus of overlapping whispers, dozens of them, maybe more, rising and falling in an eerie harmony that reminded her of wind chimes made of bone, and above that murmur the reflection moved again, turning its head not toward her this time but toward the back seat, as though acknowledging the second figure that now sat behind her in clearer shape than before, its reflection face coming into faint focus in the rearview mirror, a long, gaunt jawline, a hollowed mouth that opened and shut slowly as though chewing the air, and eyes that remained clouded and unfocused, as if the fog had molded a face without understanding how eyes should look. And Hale's skin crawled as the two figures seemed to communicate silently, their movements synchronized with a strange, puppet grace that made her feel less like she was sharing the car with ghosts and more like she was surrounded by unfinished sketches of people, reflections that had almost, but not quite, become real. And when she finally forced herself to look forward again, she saw something ahead of her that made her breath collapse into her lungs, a figure standing in the middle of the road, tall and crooked, its outline blurred by fog yet etched just clearly enough to reveal limbs that hung at wrong angles, as though they had once been broken and then reassembled incorrectly, and she slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the wet asphalt, the car fishtailing slightly before straightening, and for a moment the figure remained still in the headlights, head tilted downward like a marionette, awaiting permission to move. And Hale whispered a trembling plea, "Please move, please move, please move." But instead the figure's head snapped upward in a motion too fast, too sharp to belong to anything living, and its face, if it could be called a face, gleamed white and smooth like porcelain smeared with fog, and the instant their eyes met, or rather the places where its eyes should have been met hers, the reflections inside the car reacted violently, the passenger reflection jerking forward so sharply that its blurred forehead nearly collided with the mirror surface, while the backseat figure leaned sideways, pressing both reflected palms against the glass as though trying to brace itself for impact or breach a barrier, and Hale screamed, flooring the accelerator and swerving around the figure in the road, almost clipping the guardrail as she did, and the fog swallowed the shape instantly, as if pulling it back into whatever crevice it had emerged from, and she sped forward, breaths ragged as she tried to make sense of the unnatural synchronicity between the reflection beings and the thing that had appeared on the asphalt. But before she could gather her thoughts, the mirror began to distort again, warping at the edges like metal beginning to melt, and the passenger reflection pressed its face so close to the glass that the surface seemed to bow outward, and Hale could see detail now, awful, impossible detail, the texture of its skin like something waterlogged, its mouth stretching too wide, corners cracked as though it had been forced into a smile over and over until the shape stuck, and its teeth, if they were teeth at all, looked faintly translucent, like shards of ice rather than bone, and it lifted a hand and pressed its reflection palm to the mirrored surface, fingers splayed, and a soft creaking sound filled the cabin as though the mirror itself were beginning to fracture beneath the pressure, and Hale whispered, "Stop," not knowing whether she meant the reflected thing or the shuddering glass or her own spiraling panic, but the fog pressed harder against the side window now, forming swirls that resolved themselves into hand-shaped smears dragging downward, and she felt the faintest vibration against the actual passenger side glass, a tap, no, a knock, measured and deliberate, matching the motions of the reflection's hand in the mirror exactly, and the realization struck her like ice. The reflection wasn't mimicking something outside was mimicking the reflection, as though the two were trying to sync, trying to close the distance between themselves by meeting in the glass, and the mirror pulse cracked again, a hairline fracture forming across its surface, tiny but visible, a whisper of what would come next if she didn't get out, if she didn't escape this loop of mirrored movement and fog-borne imitation, and the reflection beings leaned in unison now, the one in the passenger mirror raising its hand higher, the backseat figure stretching its pale reflection fingers across the upper edge of the glass like a child reaching for a windowsill, and the fog outside cleared just briefly enough for her to see the guardrail ahead, meaning she was nearing the edge of the pass, perhaps moments from freedom, but the reflection in the mirror shook its head slowly, an unmistakable gesture of disapproval, almost pity, and its smile widened in that fractured, unnatural way as though it were telling her she did not understand what waited beyond the pass, what she had already allowed inside the car just by looking, and her heart hammered against her ribs as she whispered, "Please, please let me leave," though she knew reflections did not grant mercy, and the fog answered her instead, slamming against the windshield in a thick, violent gust that made the entire car shudder, and in that moment she saw a face, not the reflection man's, but another entirely, pressed against the fog on the glass outside, a face distorted by moisture and motion, eyes hollow, mouth open too wide, and it dragged downward with a wailing smear, as though sinking beneath the weight of the fog itself, and Hale screamed, wrenching the wheel to correct her trajectory as the road widened and the guardrail gave way to a slope leading down toward the first sign of distant lights, civilization, safety, anything not carved of fog and glass, and she burst out of the thickest cloud like a swimmer breaking the surface of water, the fog thinning abruptly as headlights from the valley below glimmered faintly through the spaces between the trees, but the relief that filled her chest shattered instantly when she looked back at the mirror one last time, because the reflections had not disappeared with the fog, they had grown sharper, almost complete, and the man in the passenger reflection lifted his hand and drew a single finger down the glass, leaving a thin, unmistakably visible streak on her side of the mirror, before smiling wider, eyes hollow and triumphant, as if finally arriving exactly where he intended to be. Hale Carrington tore down the final stretch of Oakhaven Pass with the desperate conviction of someone fleeing a collapsing world, the thinning fog peeling away from the windshield in ragged sheets as though the mountain were reluctantly releasing her, but even as the road widened and the valley lights blinked faintly ahead, glowing like distant candles in a far-off chapel, she knew, deep in her bones, that something inside the car had not stayed behind with the fog, that the reflections which had clung to the glass were no longer entirely confined to the places mirrors belonged, and the hairline crack running down the center of the rearview mirror pulsed faintly with each vibration of the car, as if something on the other side were testing the surface, pressing a little harder each time, and though she tried not to look, her gaze kept darting up involuntarily, pulled by a force deeper than curiosity. And each time she caught the mirror's reflection she saw the man more clearly, no longer fog-smudged or half-formed, but rendered with unsettling precision, sitting in the mirrored version of her passenger seat with the posture of someone who had been riding with her for years, his face pale and taut, his eyes hollow yet gleaming with a faint, grayish luminescence that gave him a depth she wished desperately he didn't have, and he no longer moved with the slow, hesitant stiffness of something learning to mimic life. Now he leaned forward with casual ease, elbows resting on his knees, head slightly cocked as though studying her expressions the way one might examine a portrait slowly revealing its flaws, and Hale's breath stuttered as she tore her gaze back to the road, but the road itself had begun to twist unnaturally, dipping into angles she didn't trust, and the lights of the valley below glimmered in a way that made her question whether they were real at all or merely reflections of stars in a black lake. And as she descended, she heard the faintest whisper. Not from the radio, not from the foggy exterior, but from somewhere impossibly close, a breath brushing against her left ear with a warmth that wasn't hers, forming the slightest tremor of syllables that she could not fully understand yet felt entirely. You see me now, and her whole body jerked, a panicked tremor running from her shoulders to her fingertips. And she gripped the steering wheel as though it were the last solid object in a dissolving world, whispering, "You're not real, you're not real," though every instinct screamed that denial meant nothing anymore, because the reflections that had followed her through the fog had grown beyond illusion, had fed on attention, on fear, on the very act of being seen, and if reflections were meant to show what already exists, then the thing in her mirror, now fully formed, smiling with a human-like softness that made the expression even more horrifying, existed because she had allowed it to grow by acknowledging it, by fearing it, by thinking about it as something separate from the fog, and the mirror crack deepened slightly with a soft, brittle pop, like the first fracture in a frozen pond, and Hale felt the temperature in the car shift abruptly, a cold wind sweeping across her ankles as though the floor had opened to some unseen space beneath her, and she gasped, instinctively lifting her feet from the floor, bracing them awkwardly against the seat, and she whispered, "No, no, no," because she could feel something rising from the space below, a coolness that curled like fingers around her shins, and for a moment she imagined a pale hand, one not reflected but real, sliding up from beneath the driver's seat, and she jerked her legs upward entirely, trembling as she balanced awkwardly while still steering, but the presence receded, replaced by a soft tapping against the passenger side window. 3 measured knocks that matched the rhythm she had heard when the reflection beings began mimicking her earlier, and she refused to look, staring straight ahead as the road widened into the last long curve before the exit of Oakhaven Pass, the tree line thinning, the valley opening below like a promise of safety, and she pressed the accelerator until the engine roared, desperate to leave the mountain behind, but the mirror crack split again, faster this time, running down the length of the glass like a jagged lightning strike, and in the fractured surface the man's reflection remained perfectly smooth, as though the glass could shatter around him indefinitely without affecting his stability, and he lifted one finger, dragging it along the interior edge of the mirror in a gesture that reminded her of someone tracing the perimeter of a door they meant to open, and the crack split apart, the mirror buckling outward like something beneath it was pushing, and the reflection leaned nearer, impossibly close, his breath fogging the mirrored version of the glass even though the air in her car remained cold and untouched, and he formed a soft, deliberate smile just as his hand, perfectly mirrored, perfectly formed, pressed through the fractured surface of the glass, fingertips emerging like the first break of bone through skin, and Hale's scream tore from her throat as she wrenched the steering wheel, sending the car skidding dangerously close to the guardrail as she desperately swatted at the mirror, striking it with her palm in a frenzy, and the moment her skin touched the glass she felt a coldness so deep it felt like touching the surface of a corpse left in winter, and the mirror shattered fully, breaking into dozens of glittering fragments that scattered across the dashboard, her lap, the floor, and the windshield caught some of the shards which sparkled like suspended stars in the dim cabin light, and for a heartbeat, just one, Hale felt a blankness, as though the connection had snapped and the reflections were gone, and she straightened the wheel, gasping, sobbing with relief as the road leveled and the final stretch of the pass opened before her, wide and blessedly fog-free, but as Her breath began to steady. As her mind began to believe she had broken whatever had climbed into her mirror, she heard it again, a soft inhale behind her, an unmistakably human breath, shallow, thoughtful, curious, and Hale froze, her entire body turning to ice as a slow creaking sound came from the back seat, as though someone were shifting their weight gently on old upholstery, and she forced herself not to look, not to meet those hollow eyes in the flesh, but the rearview mirror was gone. She had no barrier now, no glass between her and whatever sat behind her, breathing softly in the stale cabin air, and the faintest whisper drifted forward, this time not hollow or distant, but warm against the side of her neck, "I'm not in the mirror anymore," and her cry dissolved into a choked gasp as she slammed her hand against the lock button, accelerating wildly down the final stretch toward the first gas station at the edge of the valley, the lights growing brighter, closer, promising salvation so close she could almost taste it, yet the breath behind her did not fade. It grew steadier, less ragged, more alive, as though the thing that had once been a smear in the glass was learning how lungs worked, how proximity felt, how to occupy the same air as her without hiding behind reflection, and when she finally screeched into the parking lot of the station, nearly hitting the curb in her frantic effort to stop, she threw the door open and stumbled out into the cold valley air, collapsing against the side of her car as tears blurred her vision. But when she dared turn back toward the vehicle, gasping for air, she saw a print, dark, oily, smudged, streaked along the outside of the passenger window, 5 long fingers dragging downward as though someone inside the mirror had reached out and wiped their hand across the real glass, and the gas station attendant stepped out, brows furrowed as he took in her trembling form and the streaked handprint, and he exhaled slowly, before muttering, almost with pity, "Oakhaven Pass again. People say you don't drive through there at night unless you're willing to carry someone out with you," and Hale opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to plead, to scream, but the words died as she felt warm breath, too close, too intentional, brush the back of her neck, and the man behind the counter froze, eyes widening not at her, but at something standing just behind her shoulder, something only he could see reflected in the station's window, the backseat rider. The city looked strangely softened at midnight, as if the usual hard edges of steel and glass had been blurred by the thin, drifting mist that hovered above the highway, and when Mark steered his old sedan onto the eastbound ramp, he felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle across his shoulders like a damp coat, the kind that clung to your skin no matter how many times you tried to shrug it off, and the headlights ahead stretched into pale yellow ribbons reflecting on the wet asphalt, each one flickering as though trembling from some distant, unseen breath. He rolled forward in the mild traffic jam, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel to keep himself awake, telling himself he'd make it home in 20 minutes, maybe 25 if the congestion didn't ease, and yet the quiet hum inside the cabin felt heavier than usual, almost too still, almost too perfect, until he stopped at a long red light beneath an overpass where the concrete pillars sweated rainwater, and the glow from the brake lights in front washed his interior in a gentle crimson haze, prompting him to lean back and glance casually at the rearview mirror, just a tired habit after late shifts, and the moment his eyes focused, he froze, because something pale and shapeless lay slumped across his back seat, something soft-edged, something white that seemed to catch the red light like folded fabric, and his first sleepy thought was that it must have been the bag of laundry he'd meant to drop off that morning but had forgotten again, another sign that he was too overworked, too distracted, too many things slipping through cracks he didn't know he had. The elevator at the office had been out of order, he'd stayed late fixing the monthly report, his boss had called him twice after 10 p.m., of course he'd leave something behind in the car, he reasoned, but even as he told himself that, he couldn't remember placing any laundry bag there, couldn't remember carrying anything white at all, and a faint unease, thin as a thread, pulled gently at the back of his mind, making him shift in his seat, watching that pale object without truly wanting to see it, because something about the way it lay wasn't quite right, too long, too uneven in shape, a little like fabric stretched over something that wasn't fabric underneath. But the light changed and the cars moved and he shook himself, muttering under his breath that he needed sleep more than anything. The sedan crept forward with the rest of the traffic, engines groaning softly in the damp air, and he focused on the road, but the sense of something behind him refused to loosen its grip, and then, as though responding to his attention, a faint sound reached him, not loud, not obvious, just a thin, wavering noise, almost like the whimper of a trapped animal, or perhaps the strain of fabric being tugged, pulled, or caught on something sharp, and he stiffened, gripping the wheel with both hands while telling himself that old cars make noises. That seats shift, that sometimes nothing means nothing, but the sound came again, barely audible, trembling in the space between breaths, and his instinctive glance to the mirror lasted only a fraction of a second before he forced his eyes away, willing himself not to spiral into some silly paranoia, telling himself that late-night tension was performing tricks on a mind that had been stretched too thin for too long. He lowered the radio volume until it was nothing more than a ghost of static. As though silence might help him reason, but silence only sharpened the sensation that he was not alone in the car, that something behind him occupied space, displaced air, warmed or cooled it in minuscule but unmistakable ways, and he found himself swallowing hard as he adjusted the mirror downwards just slightly, pretending the adjustment was incidental, harmless, but the moment the mirror tilt shifted the angle, the pale shape seemed to curl just a little, or perhaps it was simply the rolling of the car creating the illusion of movement, yet the instinctive tightening in his chest told him he didn't believe that, not truly, and he gripped the wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the road as the highway lights streaked past like silent, watchful sentinels. Gradually the traffic thickened again, cars stacking up before the next toll booth, their brake lights glowing like distant embers in a foggy forest, and Mark exhaled shakily, telling himself he'd check the back seat when he reached the booth, maybe shift the bag to the trunk, anything to stop this gnawing unease, but another thread of thought whispered that he didn't actually want to touch it, that even turning around might feel like something irreversible, as though looking directly at whatever sat behind him might allow it to acknowledge him fully, or worse, meet his gaze. The toll plaza loomed ahead with its soft yellow floodlights casting long shadows across the damp concrete, and he rolled down his window halfway as the cool night air brushed across his face, soothing for a moment until he noticed the toll operator staring at him before he had even come to a complete stop, her expression strangely rigid, her eyes fixed not on him but on the interior of his car as though searching for something, or as though she had already found it, and when he muttered a polite greeting and handed her the cash, her hand trembled just slightly, so slightly he might have dismissed it if the unease hadn't already been coiled inside him, and she didn't take her eyes off the back seat as she whispered, voice brittle and pale, "Sir, you might want to check behind you," and the words slid into him like ice water spilling down his spine, stealing his breath, hollowing his chest, and he felt an instinctive, animal refusal rise within him, because turning around now felt like stepping willingly into the jaws of something he'd been pretending wasn't there, pretending hadn't been shifting and breathing and pressing against the fabric of the car's interior. He managed a shaky laugh, something like a cracked apology, telling her he'd look into it, but she only stepped backward from the booth as though distancing herself from the car itself, as though the danger wasn't him but whatever sat inches behind his headrest, and when he drove away, the night seemed to close in again, the mist curling low, thick enough to blur the world into something shapeless, dreamlike, while the presence behind him, silent now, utterly still, pressed softly against the edge of his awareness until he felt his pulse flutter like a trapped moth beneath his skin, and he told himself he would not look again, would not tilt the mirror, would not turn his head, would not acknowledge anything until he was somewhere brighter, somewhere safe, but the road ahead seemed longer than before, darker than before, and something in the air felt heavy with waiting, the kind of waiting that suggested that the thing behind him already knew he would look eventually, that it had always known. The wind pressed against the windows as Mark merged back into the flow of cars, the night folding around him like a damp curtain, and for several long, trembling moments he kept both hands locked on the wheel, refusing to glance at the mirror, refusing even to shift his posture in case the movement disturbed whatever lay behind him, and as the sedan drifted between lanes under the pale sodium lights, he tried to force his mind toward normal things, his apartment's half-empty fridge, the leftover pasta he'd probably heat up, the soft hum of his old box fan, but the delicate, almost imperceptible sound rising from the back seat severed that fragile thread of normalcy. It wasn't a clear noise, nothing distinct enough to chase or identify, just a strained vibration, the faintest rustle, something like fabric being pressed against foam or someone shifting cautiously, very cautiously, to avoid being heard. And the sensation that followed wasn't fear at first but disorientation, as though the car had subtly tilted and the air inside had thickened into something warmer, tightly held, something that carried the faint herbal scent of adhesive tape and cheap detergent filtered through the stale breath of a confined space, and he found himself inhaling sharply, wondering if the smell had been there before or if it had bloomed only now, unfolding from the pale shape like a memory of confinement. He tightened his grip on the wheel and muttered, "It's nothing, just stress," though the words felt thin, unconvincing, dissolving almost instantly into the oppressive hum of the engine, and his shoulders tightened when the sound came again, a soft, trembling scrape, as though fingernails brushed against upholstery, tentative but deliberate, followed by a barely audible intake of breath that did not belong to him, and his heart tripped violently, skipping a beat so pronounced that he reached instinctively for his chest before forcing his hand back to the wheel, remembering the toll operator's warning, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on the back seat as though she'd witnessed something he still refused to name. The mist along the highway thickened, turning headlights into blurred halos, making the world ahead feel as distant and unreal as an underwater tunnel, and every few seconds he felt the pressure of a gaze, real or imagined, pressing against the base of his neck, that primitive sensation that someone too close, far too close, was watching him from within the shadows of his own car, and he fought the urge to speak, to say something, anything, just to shatter the suffocating silence, but the idea of addressing the presence, of acknowledging it directly, made his stomach clench, because what if it answered, what if something soft and muffled responded from inches behind him? He inhaled again and forced his eyes to stay forward, tracing the reflective markers on the road, counting them like prayer beads, trying to anchor himself, but each reflection seemed to shimmer strangely as though trembling from the same jittery pulse racing through his body, and he whispered under his breath, "Don't look, don't," only to stop mid-sentence as a sudden, faint thump tapped against the back of his seat, too soft to be accidental, too human in rhythm, and the shock traveled up his spine like a cold whisper of fingers trailing over bone, making him jolt forward slightly, biting down a small gasp. He sat rigid, breath caught in his throat, listening as the tapping faded, replaced by an even softer sound, an attempt at movement, maybe, an effort at shifting weight without making noise, the way someone restrained might try to adjust themselves in desperation, and although logic insisted that no one could be there, that he hadn't picked anyone up, that he'd driven straight from the office and locked the car when he left it that morning, another part of his mind, the part that still clung to the toll operator's trembling voice, whispered a darker thought. What if she wasn't warning me about something appearing, but something already there, something that didn't need to open a door because it had been waiting long before I ever stepped inside? He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat scraping like sandpaper, and a memory surfaced, barely formed, of walking to the parking garage earlier, the orange emergency lights flickering above empty rows, the echo of his footsteps blending with distant metallic clatters, and he tried to recall if he'd heard anything unusual, any door left ajar, any shadow out of place, but exhaustion blurred everything, turning his recollection into a smear of indistinct shapes and sounds. Suddenly another sound drifted from behind him, softer, closer, a strained release of breath followed by the faintest vibration of air, almost a whimper, and his pulse hammered so violently that he felt dizzy, vision flickering as though his fear were dimming the world around him, and he found himself whispering, "This isn't real," though even he could hear the lie in his voice, shaking, unraveling. Traffic crawled again and he slowed with it, the red glow of brake lights washing over the interior, staining the hail shape behind him in a warm, pulsing hue that seemed to make its outline sharper, more defined, even though he refused to meet the mirror's gaze, and he knew, absolutely knew, he could not keep driving without confronting the truth of what was unfolding inside his own car. His breath trembled as he reached out, not toward the mirror but toward the radio, turning the volume dial up 10 degrees, filling the cabin with a low hum of static-tinged jazz, hoping that music might drown out the soft, shivering noises behind him, but the notes only seemed to emphasize the wrongness, each saxophone sigh sounding like an echo of trapped breath, each cymbal hiss mimicking the brush of fabric against struggling limbs. The mist swallowed the skyline now, turning the highway into an endless corridor where the world outside his windows dissolved into drifting shades of silver and charcoal, and with every mile the presence behind him felt more insistent, its subtle noises aligning with the rhythm of his heartbeat as though syncing itself to his fear, and he realized with growing dread that the sounds were not random but patterned, sharp inhale, rustle, faint strain, pause, then again, sharper, as though someone bound and gagged were trying to adjust their posture or slip out of restraints, and the horrifying clarity of that thought made his breath crack. He dropped one hand from the wheel and wiped it across his jeans, trying to dry the sweat gathering in his palm, but the act of loosening his grip made the car swerve slightly and he corrected quickly, cursing under his breath, yet for the smallest fraction of a second, just as the headlights dipped over a slight curve in the road, he felt something shift behind him, the kind of shift that altered the balance of weight in a vehicle, subtle but unmistakable, and his stomach twisted so violently he nearly pulled onto the shoulder. Instead he squeezed the wheel harder than ever, knuckles whitening, jaw clenching until his teeth throbbed, and the thought rose again, sharper, unavoidable now. It's not a bag. It was never a bag. The tapping returned, once, twice, against the back of his seat, gentler now, almost pleading, followed by a muffled vibration of fabric, something straining beneath adhesive, and with that, a whisper of air brushed the back of his neck, not a breath, not quite, but something disturbingly close to the warmth of breath, and he felt his skin crawl in slow, creeping waves, the sensation rising into his scalp, making every hair stand as though pulled upward by invisible fingers. His mind fractured into too many thoughts at once. Should I stop? Should I call someone? Should I run? Should I look? But each question only deepened the dread lodged behind his sternum, because he felt, with growing certainty, that the presence behind him was waiting for a moment of acknowledgement, for him to look, to lock eyes in the mirror, to break whatever fragile barrier still kept him from fully understanding the nature of what had come into his car. The mist swirled thicker now, headlights diffusing into soft halos that pulsed like distant warning beacons, and his heart thrummed with a rising, inevitable realization that part of the fear wasn't only about what was in the back seat, but about the dawning suspicion that it had been there before the toll booth, before the traffic jam, before he even left the office parking garage, that the soft, pale shape had been waiting for him long before he ever noticed it at all. The highway narrowed as construction cones forced the traffic into a single slow-moving lane, and the cars ahead crawled forward like a procession through fog, each muffled engine note a reminder that the world was continuing on as usual while Mark's own reality tightened into something small, fragile, and unbearably tense, and although he kept his eyes rigidly focused on the taillights in front of him, the weight of the unseen presence behind him thickened by the second, pressing against the edges of his awareness like a trapped breath begging to be acknowledged, until it felt impossible, physically impossible, not to look, not to seek confirmation of the shifting, straining sounds rising from the back seat. His pulse thudded in his throat as the tapping returned, softer this time, so soft he might have mistaken it for his imagination if not for the way the noise synced perfectly with the slight forward jerk of the car when the line crept another few feet, and then came the faintest muffled whimper, barely audible beneath the hum of engines around him, but unmistakable, human, struggling, desperate, and that one small sound shattered the last of his rationalizations, cutting through the fog of denial with the clarity of a blade drawn slowly across glass, and he felt his breath shorten, his lungs tightening as though they were trying to retreat deeper into his ribs. The steering wheel trembled slightly beneath his palms, not because the car was shaking but because his own hands were, and he forced himself to inhale deeply, telling himself that he could not keep driving blind to whatever was happening just inches behind his head, that pretending nothing was wrong would not protect him, that sooner or later he would have to face what had been breathing his air, rustling his upholstery, pressing against the back of his seat with small, frantic movements that grew more insistent each passing minute. The mist thickened outside, turning the construction floodlights into smeared halos of pale gold, and for a moment everything outside the windshield blurred into a dreamlike haze that made the interior of the car feel even more isolated, like a sealed capsule drifting through an underwater cavern, and in that suspended quiet, the whisper of fabric behind him shifted again, long, strained, pulling at something tight. Then a stifled grunt as though someone bound and gagged was trying to reposition themselves without the use of their hands, and the awful, rising truth pressed back into his mind. Someone is in my car. His mouth went dry, so dry he couldn't even swallow at first, and a tremor passed through him that felt dangerously close to panic, but panic, he realized with a thin thread of clarity, was more dangerous than whatever waited behind him. Panic meant losing control, swerving, crashing, trapping himself, and so he forced his breathing to slow, forced his shoulders down, forced his thoughts into a narrow, razor-edged focus as he whispered a shaky promise into the quiet, just look, just look. Once, just to know, though the words felt like a betrayal of his earlier instinctive refusal to engage, as if speaking them out loud had invited something to lean closer, as though the presence in the back seat had been waiting for permission. Another faint whimper rose behind him, longer this time, strained with what sounded like pain, and his chest constricted so hard it hurt, because there was nothing supernatural in that sound. Nothing figment-like or imagined. It was unmistakably human, the kind of muffled cry made when someone's mouth is sealed and their lungs are fighting for breath, and that realization terrified him more deeply than any ghostly explanation could have, because the living, when they were desperate, were far more unpredictable than the dead. Traffic halted abruptly ahead, a red sea of brake lights freezing in place, and the sudden stillness of his own car made the interior feel suffocating. The silence too sharp, too aware, and he knew that if he didn't look now, in this paused moment, he never would, and the not knowing might destroy him more thoroughly than whatever truth the mirror could show. His right hand reached up, slow as thawing ice, trembling but deliberate, fingers brushing the edge of the rearview mirror, and for a moment he simply held it there, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingertips, grounding himself in something physical before committing to the act that would tear apart the fragile curtain of denial separating him from the thing. Behind him, he inhaled, once, twice, then tugged the mirror ever so slightly downward, just enough to shift the angle, and his stomach lurched as his own wide, terrified eyes came into view first, glowing with reflected red light, before the mirror dipped just a fraction more, and then he saw her. She wasn't a bag. She wasn't fabric. She wasn't anything that could be mistaken for an object now that the mirror framed her fully in the dim glow of the brake lights. A woman lay half-curled across the back seat, her wrists bound behind her with rough, fraying rope that had cut deep into her skin, leaving dark lines that throbbed faintly with every twitch of her weakened muscles, and her ankles were similarly tied, the rope looped tight around her legs in a sloppy but brutal knot as though done in haste. Strips of silver duct tape wrapped around the lower half of her face, stretched so tightly that the adhesive puckered around her cheeks, distorting her attempts to breathe, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were wide, bloodshot, shimmering with terror that was so raw and so immediate that it struck him like a physical blow, rooting him to the seat as though gravity itself had doubled. She met his gaze instantly, desperately, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow movements as though she had been struggling long before he ever noticed her, and there was something pleading, urgent, agonized in the way she strained subtly forward, trying to move. Trying to speak through the mummified tape around her mouth, trying to tell him something essential that the constraints would not allow. A broken, muffled sound pushed through the tape as she attempted again, her whole body trembling with the effort, and Mark felt the air leave his lungs as the gravity of what he was seeing crashed into him. Someone had left her here, in his car, someone had tied her, silenced her, hidden her, and he had been driving unknowingly with her trapped feet away from him. Every sound she made a call for help he had chosen to ignore until now. His mind spiraled with frantic questions. How did she get here? Who put her here? How long had she been like this? Was someone watching him now? Were they following him? And as he searched her expression, looking for anything that might explain the horror unfolding inside his own vehicle, he noticed a deeper detail beneath her fear, a flicker of recognition, not of him specifically but of something about the situation, a fear sharpened not just by her suffering but by her awareness of something he had not yet understood. She writhed suddenly, pulling hard against the rope around her wrists, lifting her bound hands an inch off the seat, before collapsing back, exhausted, and he saw her tilt her head forward with desperate urgency, making a strained, guttural noise through the tape, and he leaned in slightly, too stunned to look away, too compelled by the raw terror in her eyes to ignore her attempt at communication. The noise came again, longer, with a rasping edge, and he realized with a jolt that she was trying to form words despite the tape, trying to say something to him, something that mattered enough for her to fight through pain and suffocation to deliver. He whispered, What are you trying to say?" before he even realized the words had left his mouth, and she shook her head violently, eyes widening in frantic warning, before forcing out a tortured, muffled approximation of speech, her voice warped and strangled by the adhesive, but still, somehow, recognizable. NN and AAA, NN and YU, and then, with one convulsive surge of breath and muscle, she strained forward, locking eyes with him through the mirror, and her voice, mangled but unmistakably urgent, pushed through. "You are not him." The word slashed through him like cold steel, draining all warmth from his body, leaving him suspended in a numbed, electrified silence as their meaning took root in his mind, because she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. She wasn't warning him about her own presence. She was warning him about someone else. Someone she believed he might be. Someone she thought might come back for her. Someone whose absence was temporary. And as that realization settled, the engine sputtered once, twice, then died abruptly, plunging the car into darkness and silence in the middle of the highway. For a heartbeat after the engine cut out, there was only the strange, ringing quiet that follows an unexpected loss of sound. No hum of the motor, no soft vibration through the floorboards, only the hollow stillness of a stalled vehicle stranded in a slowly moving river of cars. And Mark felt the silence hit him like a sudden vacuum, as though someone had sucked the air out of the cabin, leaving everything inside suspended and weightless, including his ability to breathe. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, casting an intermittent glow across the interior before failing entirely, plunging the sedan into dimness lit only by the distant wash of red brake lights ahead, their blurred glow filtering through the fog to paint the trapped woman in the back seat with a sickly pulse of color, making her appear to throb with unease as she struggled against her restraints. Emitting a muted keening sound through the duct tape that tightened Mark's chest like a vice, his fingers fumbled for the ignition, twisting the key once, twice, feeling the dead, useless click of a non-responsive starter, and each attempt only sharpened the rising terror clawing up his throat as he whispered, come on, please," because the idea of being immobilized on a highway at midnight, with a bound, panicking stranger in his back seat and no explanation for how she got there, felt like stepping into a nightmare he had no map for, no grounding logic to cling to. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the traffic around him rolled past slowly, unaware, indifferent, as though the whole world had decided to drift forward without him as he remained suspended in a suffocating pocket of stillness, trapped between the pulsing panic in the car and the vast, uncaring night outside. He twisted the key again and the car responded with a faint, half-hearted groan before lapsing into silence once more, and a cold, sinking dread pooled in his stomach as he realized that whatever was happening was not mechanical, not random, not coincidental at all. A sharp thump came from the back seat, sudden, desperate, and he flinched violently, glancing at the mirror in spite of himself. The bound woman had pushed herself upright as much as her restraints allowed, her arms contorting painfully behind her back as she tried to force herself into a sitting position, and the sheer anguish in her eyes when she looked at him sent a shock through his body that felt almost electrical, because she wasn't simply struggling, she was warning him again, her entire posture radiating urgency as she shoved her taped face toward the mirror, producing a strained, frantic muffled cry that vibrated with a kind of primal terror, the kind that suggested something worse than her own predicament, something approaching, something she could sense even if he could not. Mark's breath hitched, throat tightening until it hurt, and he whipped his head around, not fully, not yet, just enough to glance over his shoulder into the shadowed back seat, and the dim red glow filtering through the windows caught in her eyes, illuminating the glossy streaks of tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks, and she shook her head violently, as though begging him not to look away from her, pleading with him to understand that the danger wasn't her presence, but something else in the periphery, something else closing in. He turned forward again, pulse hammering so loudly he could barely hear the outside world, and he tried to reason. Someone abducted her, left her here. Maybe they're watching. Maybe they cut the engine remotely. Maybe they followed me. But each explanation crumbled under the weight of the unnatural stillness of the fog, the unnatural timing of the stall, the unnatural way the air in the car felt thicker, heavier, almost charged like the moment before lightning strikes. A soft vibration trembled through the metal frame of the sedan, accompanied by what felt like a subtle shift in weight, as though something had pressed down gently on the trunk or rear bumper, just enough to make the body of the car dip a fraction of an inch. Mark froze completely, breath trapped in his chest, every muscle tightening as he strained to listen, and beneath the muted rumble of distant engines he heard it, a slow, deliberate scrape of something rough sliding across metal, a dragging sound that traveled along the outer panel of the trunk toward the rear passenger side, moving with a chilling slowness that suggested intent rather than accident. The woman in the back seat reacted instantly, her eyes widening with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow out her expression, and she writhed violently in her bindings, forcing out a muffled scream that cracked against the confines of her taped mouth, her whole body jerking in panic as if she feared the sound outside more than her own suffocation. Mark's fingers hovered above the ignition again, though he knew it was pointless, and his gaze darted to the fog-filled darkness beyond the right window where the scrape had moved, trying to see shapes but finding only shifting shadows that refused to resolve into anything recognizable. "Is someone there?" he whispered stupidly into the stillness, the words slipping out like threads of warm breath that the fog pressed back immediately, smothering them before they could escape the vehicle. Another weight shift settled on the back of the car, stronger this time, more distinct, making the sedan rock gently, and the sensation was so unexpected, so intimate in its wrongness, that tears pricked his eyes unbidden. Something was outside. Something heavy. Something testing the boundaries of the car's shell the way a predator might test the perimeter of a cage before deciding how to enter it. He snapped his head toward the mirror again, unable to help himself, and saw the bound woman leaning forward as far as her restraints allowed, her posture distorted by desperation, her taped mouth straining to utter warnings he could only half decipher, and then her eyes flicked, sharply, warningly, toward the right rear window, urging him to look, urging him to understand that whatever lurked outside was not simply dangerous but intimately connected to her presence, to the ropes, to the possibility that she had been taken by something, or someone, far worse than a man. The fog outside the right window thickened suddenly, not swirling but pulling, drawing inward as if displaced by something large coming closer, and Mark felt his heartbeat skip clean out of rhythm as a shadow shifted on the other side of the glass, vague at first, indistinct, but undeniably human-shaped, tall and hunched slightly forward as though peering in. He recoiled instinctively, stomach dropping, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles widened, and the shape lingered there, motionless, its presence pressed against the fog like a stain, too dark and too tall to be a passing pedestrian or a construction worker, too still to be anything natural, and though he couldn't make out features, he felt, deep in his bones, that the silhouette was looking at him, studying him, comparing him to someone it expected. Someone the bound woman believed he was not. He fumbled for the lock button, pressing it repeatedly even though the doors were already locked, the soft mechanical click-click-click sounding absurdly weak in the oppressive quiet, a meaningless barrier against the thing lingering just beyond the thin pane of glass. The silhouette shifted slightly, the fog parting around it in a way that made Mark's skin crawl, and then came a soft tap against the window, delicate at first, almost polite, but the intention behind it was unmistakable, a summoning, a request to be acknowledged, a request to be let in, and Mark's breath broke into a ragged gasp as he shook his head, whispering, "No, no, please, no," even though he knew the shape couldn't hear him. Behind him, the woman let out a muffled, broken sob, and in the mirror he watched her collapse forward, not in surrender but in hysterical pleading, her eyes locked onto his with a ferocity that bordered on madness, begging him without words to understand that opening the door, looking too long, or acknowledging the silhouette's presence might be a mistake that could not be undone. Then, as if sensing her desperation, or sensing him, the car shook again, harder this time, the metal frame groaning as though something heavy had gripped the bumper with inhuman strength, and Mark screamed, twisting the ignition with all the force in his body, begging the engine to start, to come back to life, to save them from whatever had found them on the highway in the fog. And on the third desperate twist, the engine roared back to life. The moment the engine roared back to life, Mark didn't think. He reacted, slamming his foot onto the accelerator with a force born of blind terror, sending the car lurching forward so hard the tires screeched against the damp asphalt, and the sudden motion threw him back into his seat while the woman in the rear slammed sideways against the cushions with a muffled cry. The fog churned past the windows as the sedan shot through the narrow construction lane, weaving too close to the cones, too close to the barriers, but he didn't care, not about the car, not about tickets, not about anything except putting as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had pressed against the window, whatever had tapped politely for entry, whatever had rocked the vehicle with the weight and deliberateness of a thing that knew exactly who it was looking for. His breath tore out of him in shallow bursts as he sped across the stretch of highway, ignoring the startled honks of other drivers, ignoring the shaking of his own hands as he clutched the wheel, ignoring even the desperate noises rising from the back seat because he could not bring himself to slow down long enough to help her, not while the air behind him still felt touched by something cold, too cold, something that lingered like a memory rather than a physical presence, something that had followed them even though he had left it behind. He didn't dare look into the mirror. He couldn't bear to confirm whether the shadow still clung to the window or whether something else had crawled inside with them before he managed to flee, so he kept his eyes locked on the glowing overhead signs, scanning for the nearest exit, praying the engine would not sputter or falter again, praying that the violent jolt of life surging through the vehicle wasn't temporary or conditional or granted by something that wished only to chase him farther. Before cutting him loose again, when he finally veered onto the next off-ramp, the tires skidding briefly on the slick pavement, he turned down a side street lined with closed auto shops and flickering street lamps, a place so eerily quiet at this hour that even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted, as if the fog had followed him here, thickening around the edges of the world to isolate him all over again. His car rolled to a trembling halt beside a shuttered tire store, the neon sign half burnt and buzzing weakly as though struggling to breathe, and only then, only when the engine steadied into a low, shivering hum, did he allow his hands to release the wheel. They fell uselessly into his lap, shaking uncontrollably, his breath catching in his throat as though the very act of escaping had cost him something enormous. Something he wasn't sure he could name yet. "Okay," he whispered to no one, voice cracking. "Okay. You're safe. You're safe now." But the words tasted like lies the moment they hit the air. He turned toward the back seat slowly, agonizingly slow, and the woman lay collapsed sideways, chest shuddering with frantic breaths, eyes overflowing with something beyond fear, something almost mournful, as though she knew something he didn't, something awful. Her wrists were still bound, her ankles trapped, the tape still plastered across her mouth, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, overwhelmed by guilt that he had driven for miles knowing she was suffering inches behind him. Focused only on his own survival, he reached out shakily. "It's okay," he said again, this time softer. "I'll get you out. I promise. I'm calling the police." The moment he said, "police," something in her eyes flickered, not relief, not dread, but a strange, exhausted resignation, the expression of someone who had fought for far too long and no longer believed in rescue, and the sight of that expression almost undid him. He grabbed his phone from the console, hands trembling as he dialed 911, his voice breaking as he told the dispatcher about the woman, the restraints, the condition of the car. He didn't mention the shadow outside the window, didn't mention the scrape, or the tap, or the words she had forced through the tape, "You are not him," because he knew how that would sound in the cold fluorescence of a police report. Within minutes, sirens pierced the night far off, growing louder as they approached, and he stepped out of the car, breathing in the cold air with something like desperation. His knees buckled slightly as he leaned against the hood, trembling in the aftermath, but the rush of relief came thick and overwhelming. He had done the right thing, he had escaped whatever horror stalked that stretch of highway, and help was finally arriving. 2 squad cars pulled up behind him, lights flashing red and blue across the fog, officers stepping out with cautious professionalism as they approached. He lifted his hands instinctively, palms open, and explained again what he had found, how he had driven without realizing she was there. They nodded, moving to the door he'd left open. And then, a soft, curt exchange of radio static. A long pause. A quiet murmur between the officers. Followed by the cold, clinical words that froze the blood in his veins. "There's no one in your vehicle, sir." Mark's breath evaporated. What? No. No, she's there. She was bound, she was taped, please, look again. "We did," the officer replied gently. "Your car is empty. The back seat's clear." He shoved past them, stumbling toward the open door, breath caught in his throat as he peered inside, and the interior stared back at him empty, undisturbed, the seat cushions smooth, no rope, no tape, no indentation of a body that had lain struggling there only minutes before. No lingering scent of adhesive. No trace of tears. No trace of her at all. His mouth worked soundlessly. "That's impossible," he whispered. "She was there. I saw her. I heard her. She told me." But the officers exchanged a sympathetic glance, the kind reserved for panic-induced hallucinations or exhausted men who worked too late into the night. They took his statement. They checked his license and registration. They asked him to breathe. Then they escorted him home. For days afterward, Mark told himself it had been stress, fatigue, an episode induced by lack of sleep and fear. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Because the car still smelled faintly of adhesive sometimes, especially at night. And sometimes, when he sat behind the wheel long enough, he could swear the seatbelt beside him tugged ever so slightly, as though someone invisible were trying to sit up. But the real fracture came 2 weeks later. He was half asleep on his couch when the late-night news flickered on. A segment about an active investigation. A report on a serial killer who abducted women. A killer who always took their final victim alive, bound, gagged, left somewhere to die as a decoy. And the reporter's words froze him colder than anything on that highway ever had. Investigators believe the killer used the same make and model of car as his own to transport victims. The camera showed the suspect vehicle. It was identical to Mark's. Down to the color. Down to the year. Down to the dent in the rear bumper, a dent his own car bore from a hit-and-run last winter. The reporter continued. Authorities are still searching for one missing woman believed to be alive at the time of the killer's death. Mark's heart stopped. Because the screen displayed her face. The same trembling eyes. The same soft features. The same woman who had lain bound in his backseat and whispered, "You are not him." And the killer, according to the broadcast, had died in a police shootout 3 months earlier. So if she had been alive after his death, if she had tried to warn Mark, if she had appeared in his car, then who, or what, had been searching the fog for the man she mistook him for? And more importantly, why had it followed his car instead? The whispering woods. The forest was already awake when David turned off the main highway and onto the narrow dirt service road that tunneled through the heart of Blackwood National Forest, the canopy folding overhead like a vaulted ceiling woven from ancient boughs, each one dripping with moss and holding decades of unspoken stories in their quiet sway. And although he'd driven this route a dozen times before, tonight the woods felt denser, darker, the air unusually heavy as if saturated with the breath of something old and watchful. The gravel crunched beneath his truck's tires, a rhythmic grinding that usually soothed him during night deliveries, but even that familiar sound felt muted now, swallowed by the thick hush of the forest as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, listening, waiting. And David, who prided himself on being the kind of man who didn't scare easily, who scoffed at the ghost stories swapped by the other drivers during late-night stops, felt an odd pressure settling in his chest, the kind that reminded him of standing too close to a cliff edge, sensing the drop before seeing it. The fading light slanted through the branches in thin, slivered beams that painted the dirt road in streaks of honey-colored dusk, and with every mile, the forest seemed to lean closer, narrowing the path, its gnarled roots twisting up along the embankments like limbs reaching toward the truck. And he muttered under his breath about budget cuts, unmaintained service roads, and how he'd rather be anywhere else than hauling lumber through a national forest almost synonymous with cursed legends and eerie disappearances. He reached for his thermos, taking a swig of lukewarm coffee that did nothing to clear the heavy fatigue draped across him like a damp blanket, and as he set it back down, something thudded in the bed of the truck, a small bump that might have been shifting cargo, but that brief sound amplified oddly in the stillness, echoing faintly as though the trees were returning it with interest. "It's just wood," he muttered, glancing in the side mirror to reassure himself, but the forest reflected back only darkness between trunks, thick and impenetrable, and he rolled down the window a few inches to let in fresh air, expecting the familiar crispness of pine and soil, yet what drifted in was heavier, a musty, clay-like scent as though the earth had recently been overturned, exposing something damp and hidden beneath. He slowed slightly as he approached a bend marked by a faded wooden sign, "Leave no trace. All offerings returned." And scoffed loudly at the carved warning, shaking his head at the absurdity of the old folklore about sacred land and forest guardians the locals still whispered about, dismissing them as relics of small-town superstition. Still grumbling, he reached over, grabbed the overstuffed trash bag he'd shoved onto the passenger seat earlier, a mess of food wrappers, old receipts, and drink cans from several long shifts, and popped open the window entirely, letting the cool breath of the forest rush in as he casually hurled the bag out into the brush with a grunt of effort, watching it tumble down the shallow embankment and disappear beneath a curtain of ferns. "There," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans with irritated satisfaction. "Nature can compost that or whatever," and he returned his focus to the road ahead, unaware that the air itself seemed to shift in response. As though the trees had exhaled all at once, their branches giving a unified creak that rippled outward like a warning whispered through an unseen network of wood and soil. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful but charged, vibrating faintly with tension, and David frowned as he drove deeper into the forest, the road growing narrower, the trees growing closer, their trunks forming crooked silhouettes that flickered past his headlights in uneven rhythms. That was when he first heard it, so soft he almost dismissed it, a faint susurration rising from the undergrowth, like wind brushing across thousands of leaves at once, except the air was still, not even a breeze tickling the branches overhead, and the whispering didn't have the randomness of nature, but a pattern, a cadence, almost like speech. He straightened instinctively, lowering the radio volume until it clicked off entirely, leaving only the soft rumble of the engine and the whispers threading through the trees, curling around the cab of the truck like smoke. He strained to listen, leaning forward slightly, and though the words were indistinct, blurred by the thick foliage, something about their tone unsettled him, low, rhythmic, murmuring not in one direction but circling from all sides, weaving through the woods with an unerringly deliberate motion, and he shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck as goosebumps prickled across his skin. "It's just the tires," he muttered, "just rubber on gravel," but the words lacked confidence, evaporating almost instantly in the heavy hush of the woods, and the whispers grew a fraction louder as though responding to his doubt, rising in a wave from the forest floor and crawling up the slopes on either side of the road until they brushed against his open window like invisible fingers trailing across the glass. He rolled the window up quickly, a soft click sealing the cab, but even then he could still hear it, the same murmuring, more insistent now, layered with something like disapproval, as though he had broken a rule he didn't bother to learn. His heartbeat quickened, an uncomfortable pressure building in his ears, and he tapped the steering wheel nervously, wishing he hadn't thrown the trash but too proud to admit even to himself that superstition might have a place in the real world. The truck rounded a tighter bend and the forest changed subtly, the trees growing denser, taller, their trunks darkened as though stained by something seeping upward from the soil, and their branches hung lower, so low they brushed against the top of the truck with soft, grazing taps that felt almost intentional, as though the woods were testing the shape of the vehicle, assessing him, remembering him. A sudden, sharper whisper cut through the murmur, one distinct, pointed, urgent, echoing directly beside the cab for a split second before dissolving back into the foliage, and David flinched violently, his hands tightening on the wheel as a cold shiver rippled down his spine. He sped up instinctively, the truck bumping over rocks and roots as the forest seemed to close in, listening, judging, following. And the whispering shifted to something deeper, a guttural undertone threading through the leaves like a warning spoken through clenched teeth, and although he tried to ignore it, to rationalize it, a creeping dread lodged itself beneath his ribs, growing heavier with every passing second, because the voices, whatever they were, sounded angrier now, less like murmured conversation and more like growling discontent, as though the forest had taken offense at something recent. Something tossed carelessly into its roots without permission. David swallowed hard, knuckles widening around the wheel, trying to push the memory of the thrown trash bag out of his mind, but the whispers surged again, louder this time, harsher, echoing from the canopy and the undergrowth and even the very dirt under his tires, and he suddenly realized the cadence had changed. The forest was no longer whispering, it was scolding him. And the shift in tone was unmistakable. The road straightened briefly, giving David a clearer view of the path ahead, two parallel grooves worn into the dirt, flanked on both sides by walls of cedar and spruce whose branches intertwined so heavily that the forest appeared almost solid. But no sooner had he registered the shape of the road than the whispering surged again, swelling from a murmur into a layered chorus that pressed against the truck with an almost physical force. As though the air itself had thickened with reproach, he winced at the intensity of it, leaning forward instinctively as if putting distance between himself and the windows would help, but the voices clung to him, sliding across the glass, threading into the seams of the doors, crawling beneath the cab like smoke seeking entry, and for the first time since entering Blackwood he felt an irrational urge to apologize. not to a person, not to a ranger, but to the forest itself, to the unseen presence that seemed to pulse through its soil, animating the trees and the whispering earth with something like consciousness. Before he could fully process that thought, a sharp crack snapped through the air to his left, loud enough to cut through the chorus of murmurs, and a thick branch whipped out from the darkness, slamming against the side of the truck with a violent thud that jolted him sideways in his seat, the shockwave rattling the windows and sending a shower of pine needles cascading across the windshield. He cursed loudly, heart pounding, jerking the wheel to the right to avoid another low-hanging limb, and the truck fishtailed slightly on the loose dirt before he corrected it, breath bursting out in a sharp gasp as he stared wide-eyed at the gouge left by the impact, a long, jagged scrape carved deep into the paint, too deep to be caused by a branch alone, almost claw-like in its precision. "What the hell?" he started, but the words were swallowed by a new wave of sound rising from the forest, no longer whispers but guttural, pulsing growls that rolled outward from the underbrush like a collective snarl, and he pressed harder on the accelerator, urging the truck forward as another branch snapped across the hood, leaving a harsh metallic screech that vibrated through the cabin. His pulse thrashed in his throat as he sped through the narrowing corridor, the trees now leaning in so aggressively their tips scratched overhead like skeletal fingers testing the thickness of metal, and he gritted his teeth, muttering, "It's the wind, it's just the wind," even though there was no wind, not a single breeze shifting the leaves except when they moved with deliberate, violent intention. As the truck climbed a small rise in the road, the forest on his right erupted with motion, roots burst from the soil like serpents, thick tendrils twisting toward the truck, dragging clumps of earth behind them as they surged upward and scraped along the metal undercarriage with a deep, resonant growl that sent a vibration straight into his bones. David let out a strangled shout, eyes widening as he slammed his foot down harder. The truck lurching forward, engine roaring in protest as he pushed it beyond its usual limits, and the roots receded only slightly, as though the forest were testing his speed, gauging his desperation, measuring how much defiance he had left. He tried to radio the main logging station, grabbing the handset from its cradle, but all that greeted him was static, thick, dense static layered with faint echoes, rhythmic pulses that almost matched the cadences of the forest's whispers earlier, and the realization that even the airwaves were compromised sent another wave of dread flooding through him. He threw the radio down, focusing on the road ahead, and that was when he saw a large limb, thick as a man's torso, descending across the path. Like a barrier deliberately lowered to block him in, the shadow of it stretching across the headlights like a warning. "No, no, no," he gasped, gripping the wheel with both hands as he swerved violently to the left, the truck's tires skidding on loose gravel before catching again, and the vehicle shot past the fallen limb with inches to spare, but not before another branch lashed out like a whip, carving a deep score along the side of the truck, metal shearing with a shriek of tearing paint and steel. David shouted in fear and frustration, the sound raw and animalistic, but even his own voice was nearly drowned by the furious crescendo rising from the woods, the whispers now replaced entirely by guttural roars and distorted, breathy hisses that bled together into a single, wrathful voice, an ancient, enraged exhalation from something that had lived in the soil long before any road had been cut through it. And then, just as the noise became unbearable, something moved beside him. Fast. Tall. Silhouetted against the blur of trees like a streak of darkness peeling itself from the forest's edge. At first he thought it was another bending trunk or jetting route, but the shape kept pace with the truck perfectly, matching its increasing speed with unnatural ease, its long, slender limbs galloping in a sickening, rhythmic motion that suggested joints bending in ways no living creature's joints should bend. David froze for a heartbeat, his eyes glued to the side mirror, and when the shape burst fully into the glow of the headlights angled off his passenger side door, he felt his breath seize painfully in his lungs. It was humanoid but impossibly tall, towering even while hunched, its limbs twisted and coated in layered bark and dark, oozing mud, its ribs visible beneath stretched tendrils of root-like sinew, and its head, its head, was a hollow cavity of writhing roots that formed a faceless void, no eyes, no nose, nothing except a wide, vertical slit that stretched downward like a splitting trunk, opening and closing in a grotesque approximation of a scream he could not hear but could feel. Reverberating through the cab of the truck, the creature leaned closer, each stride kicking up soil that struck the truck like fistfuls of gravel, and its elongated fingers, more like clawed branches, lashed out, striking the door with a force that dented the steel inward and sent a freezing vibration through David's arm. He screamed, high, desperate, involuntary, and mashed the accelerator so hard his foot dropped, but the creature matched his pace easily, tilting its hollow face toward him with an intent that felt almost personal, accusatory, resentful, as though it recognized him, as though it had watched him toss the trash bag into the ferns and marked him the moment it hit the earth. Branches overhead curved inward, scraping his roof in rhythmic, violent strokes, each one punctuated by the creature's cry, a low, vibrating roar that shook the mirrors and made the windshield tremble. David felt the truck's frame quiver under the relentless assault, each strike carving deeper gouges into the metal, and he shouted a hoarse, panicked plea into the empty cab. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, okay? But the forest did not listen. It only roared louder. The road ahead widened suddenly, revealing a clearing where the trees thinned and the dirt path sloped downward toward the distant edge of the forest, and David seized the opportunity, wrenching the wheel to the right and letting gravity hurl him forward. The abrupt acceleration finally threw the creature off balance, sending it stumbling into the embankment with a sound like splintering timber, and David didn't wait to see it recover. He sped toward the tree line with every ounce of strength. Left in the engine, the forest's rage following him in a wave of whispers and roars that trailed behind him until, after what felt like an eternity, the road spilled out into open land where the trees fell away and the night air no longer carried the weight of something watching. Only then did the whispers stop. Abruptly. As if the forest had sealed its mouth all at once. But the silence that followed was far worse. The sudden quiet after the assault was so absolute, so violently complete, that it rang in David's ears like the aftershock of an explosion. The absence of sound somehow louder than the forest's furious roar had been moments before, and as the truck burst into the thinning tree line, bouncing over ruts and scattering loose stones behind it, David clung to the steering wheel with trembling fingers, his breath sawing painfully in and out of his lungs as though his body had only just remembered how to breathe. The open stretch ahead, barely more than a wide clearing where the logging road met the boundary of the national forest, felt unreal, as though he had driven through a membrane separating two worlds, and yet the sense of danger clung to him like sap on skin, sticky, suffocating, impossible to shake. He risked a glance in the side mirror, expecting to see only darkness where the trees met the clearing, but what he saw instead made his stomach collapse into itself. The forest line was shifting. Not the way normal foliage moved, not swaying or bending or rustling, no, the entire wall of trees seemed to pulse, as though the trunks were expanding and contracting with massive breaths, and the shadows between them deepened, coagulated, and then slid forward across the ground like liquid darkness pooling outward. Something was emerging, not running this time but rising, growing, unfurling from the forest's edge with a grim, deliberate grace that suggested patience rather than frenzy, as though the creature no longer needed to chase him, as though it knew there was no true outside to escape into. David jerked his eyes back to the road, but the shifting presence pressed against his awareness, magnetic and suffocating, pulling his attention backward even as instincts screamed at him to keep driving. He dared not let the truck slow, not by a single mile per hour, yet the engine whined in protest, the RPM needle trembling in the red as though the vehicle itself feared the woods and pleaded not to be dragged back into them. He pressed harder, teeth gritted, the wheel vibrating beneath his hands, the cab rattling with every bump, and then something hit him again, not physically this time but psychologically, a jolt of recognition so sudden it stole the breath from his lungs. The forest hadn't stopped chasing him. It had simply changed tactics. A faint sound rose from behind him, quiet at first, barely audible above the engine's strained groan, but unmistakable in its intent, a low, rhythmic thudding, like heavy footsteps bounding across the earth in enormous strides, each impact shaking the ground just enough for the vibration to travel up through the chassis of the truck, rattling the loose tools in the glove box, quivering through his bones. His heart pounded violently as he reached for the side mirror again, hesitating for one terrible second, knowing that seeing the creature would be worse, but fear left him no room for denial. The reflection snapped into view. The creature was not simply running this time, it was hurling itself forward in enormous, unnatural leaps, its long limbs unfolding like broken branches snapping outward, allowing it to cover impossible distances between strides. Each landing sent dark soil exploding from the ground, clinging to its bark-coated skin like wet ash, and its faceless head tilted upward toward the truck, the vertical slit in its hollow visage widening like a yawning chasm, pulsing with a furious, vibrating howl that didn't reach David's ears but reverberated. Deep in his chest, like the tremor preceding a landslide, roots extended from its feet, if they could be called feet, dragging behind it in a wake of torn earth and crushed undergrowth, and every time its limbs touched the ground, the forest behind it seemed to recoil, as though even the trees feared the wrathful power animating the creature's pursuit. David cursed in a cracked whisper, the sound barely more than a gasp, and he pressed the accelerator until the pedal could go no further, the truck bucking over the uneven terrain as it fought to reach the end of the clearing. The headlights flickered again, momentarily dimming as though drained by the fear pressing against them, but they sputtered back to life, revealing the faint outline of the paved road just beyond the last stretch of gravel and grass, salvation so close he could feel the relief rising like a sob in his throat, until something slammed into the tailgate. The impact was catastrophic, a metallic explosion that sent the entire truck lurching forward and nearly wrenching the wheel out of David's hands. He choked on a cry, his head snapping back as the seatbelt dug into his chest, and for a dizzying second he thought the truck had been lifted off the ground, but it was only momentum, the shockwave shuddering through every rivet and steel plate. The bed crumpling inward with a groan of tortured metal, panic clawed up his throat as he wrestled the wheel, eyes darting to the rearview mirror despite the primal instinct screaming not to look. The creature's face dominated the mirror. A hollow, gaping void where features should have been. A blackness deeper than shadow, deeper than earth, a pit that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. And from that void, the wide, vertical maw stretched open so far the bark-like skin around it cracked in radiating fissures, revealing pulsing sinews beneath, roots twisted with something fleshy, raw, alive, and though no sound reached his ears, the shape of the opening screamed with unmistakable rage, the force of it vibrating so violently that the mirror tremored in its mount. For one chilling instant, David felt that the thing was not merely chasing him. It was punishing him. Not for fear. Not for trespassing. But for the trash bag he had carelessly cast into its undergrowth, the offering he had not been permitted to give, the disrespect that violated a law older than roads, older than towns, older than the notion that land could be owned at all. The creature slammed the truck again, this time with one elongated arm that cracked the rear window, spiderwebbing the glass in a burst of fractures that crept outward like frost patterns on winter panes. Cold air rushed through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, a scent so potent it struck David like a physical blow, as if the forest itself were breathing into the cab, marking him, embedding its presence into his senses so he would carry the memory of this night forever, if he survived it. He let out a guttural shout, a raw sound of animal terror, and the truck burst over the final jet of uneven earth, the tires hitting pavement with a violent skid that sent the vehicle fishtailing across the road in a spray of gravel. He corrected desperately, fighting the wheel with every ounce of strength left in his trembling arms, forcing the truck into a straight line just as the headlights illuminated the open highway ahead, a space wide enough, safe enough, distant enough that the forest's reach felt finally limited, but the creature did not stop at the tree line. It lunged, leaping forward in a final, furious attempt to reach him before he crossed fully out of the wood's dominion, its limbs unfurling in a nightmarish bloom of splintered bark and writhing tendrils. And for one horrifying moment, David thought it would grab the truck, rip the doors off, drag him screaming into the undergrowth where no one would ever find his bones. But the truck accelerated just fast enough, the tires catching dry asphalt and propelling him forward with a burst of speed that left the creature suspended mid-lunge, rooted abruptly to the boundary of the forest. Frozen. Unable to take one step farther. It clawed at the earth in frustration, its limbs grinding into the soil with a sound like ancient wood cracking under the weight of centuries, and the scream that tore from its hollow maw, though still silent, shattered something inside David that he knew would never heal. Then the creature sank back into the darkness, consumed by the forest as though it had never existed, and the whispers ceased. The highway stretched ahead in a long, merciful ribbon of empty asphalt, its wide shoulders and reflective markers glowing like a lifeline laid out just for him, and for several minutes David could do nothing but drive, white-knuckled, breath hitching in shallow bursts, while his mind reeled behind him like a trailer unhitched from its wheels, thoughts crashing and tumbling with no sense of order. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, shrinking from an omnipresent wall of darkness into a distant silhouette, but even as it fell away, he could still feel its presence, humming beneath his skin, vibrating faintly in the bones of his fingers where they clenched the steering wheel, as though the woods had left an imprint not on his truck but on him personally. He drove until the trembling in his hands made it dangerous to keep going, until the adrenaline began to ebb into an overwhelming, nauseating exhaustion, and only then, when he spotted a gravel turnout just beyond a dimly lit rest area, did he pull over, the truck fishtailing slightly as he braked too fast, tires crunching to a halt in a cloud of dust. For a long moment he sat motionless, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, each tinny click echoing in the vast stillness like a reminder that he was, in fact, alive. Sweat trickled down his temples, cold despite the stale warmth trapped in the cab, and he let his eyes close for all of 2 seconds before his body jolted with the memory of the creature's hollow face inches from the window. The way its darkness swallowed light, the way its silent scream vibrated inside his ribs, and he snapped upright, gasping, wiping trembling fingers across his mouth as if to erase the memory. He forced himself to breathe, slow, steady, counting each inhale, before opening the door and stepping into the open night. The air out here felt different. Thin. Normal. Empty of intent. But the quiet wasn't comforting, it was too clean, too untouched compared to the heavy, watching hush of the forest, and as he walked around the front of the truck, gravel crunching under his boots, he felt the fragile calm unravel with each step. The moment he rounded the hood and the side of the truck became visible in the moonlight, he stopped dead in his tracks. The gouges along the metal bodywork were unmistakable. Not scratches. Not scrapes. Not the blunt impact of branches. They were long, curved, irregularly spaced, furrows carved into the steel as though by something with fingers. Fingers tipped with jagged, bark-textured claws sharp enough to shear metal but uneven enough to expose patches of bare steel beneath the torn paint. The deepest gouges bent inward sharply, leaving dents shaped with terrifying specificity, as if something had gripped the truck with deliberate strength, not lashed at it mindlessly. David reached out with a shaking hand, running his fingers along one of the deepest ruts, and felt the edges, cold, rough, splintered, like the torn skin of a wounded animal. His breath stuttered, and he realized his knees had begun to weaken again, a warm ache prickling behind them, because this damage wasn't merely the result of something attacking the truck. It was the result of something angry. Something capable of more strength than it had shown, something that had held back. He staggered toward the rear, half terrified, half compelled, needing to know the full extent of what had happened, needing to see if the tailgate had survived at all, but before he reached it, his boot struck something soft, something out of place on the gravel, and he froze. There, lying neatly against his front tire as though placed with intention rather than blown by the wind, was the trash bag he had thrown into the undergrowth hours earlier. Except now it was ripped open, eviscerated, really, the contents spilled out in a semicircle as if something had torn through it with fierce, searching hands. Empty soda cans lay crushed, wrappers torn into shreds finer than confetti, receipts scattered like pale leaves across the gravel. But the worst part wasn't the bag or its contents. It was the piece of paper resting atop the pile. Old, yellowed, edges curled as if weathered by damp soil. Too old to have been part of his trash. Too deliberate to be coincidence. He crouched slowly, dread dragging his movements downward like invisible weights. The paper felt brittle under his fingertips, the ink faded but unmistakably handwritten, and when he angled it toward the faint beam of his truck's headlight, the words revealed themselves in looping, uneven strokes. En hung gi thuok vi rong isi o lai rum. What belongs to the woods must remain in the woods. David's breath left him in a silent exhale that felt almost like a sob. His hands shook violently as he held the paper, realizing it wasn't merely a warning. It was a reprimand. A verdict. A statement of law older than any posted sign, older than the park boundaries, older than the service road he'd driven on. He let the paper fall from his fingers and staggered backward, his boots skidding on loose gravel as he looked around the turnout, suddenly certain he wasn't alone, not because he heard anything, but because the air shifted subtly, cool and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of wet soil, fresh roots, and decaying leaves. A scent that shouldn't exist this far from the tree line. A scent that followed him out of the forest. He spun around, heart slamming painfully against his ribs, scanning the dark. The highway, empty. The distant rest area, deserted. The field beyond the turnout, still, moonlit, silent. But the silence was wrong again, not natural, not empty. A listening silence. A silence with memory. A silence that felt like being watched by something hiding inside the soil itself, waiting for him to take one step too far, one breath too long, one more violation of rules he'd never cared to learn. He backed toward the truck slowly, every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get back inside the vehicle, to put distance between himself and this place before the forest decided proximity alone was enough reason to reclaim what he tried to abandon. When he finally gripped the door handle, breath shaking, he dared one last glance toward the paper lying in the gravel. A breeze, where had the wind come from, stirred it gently, and the forest in the distance, a dark silhouette on the horizon, seemed to lean a fraction inward. As if acknowledging that he had received the message. As if reminding him the debt between them was not yet settled. David slammed the truck doors shut with more force than he intended, the metallic thud echoing too loudly in the open turnout, as though the sound were traveling farther than it should, reaching places where it did not belong, and he fumbled with the ignition, hands trembling so badly he missed the key slot twice before forcing it in. The engine coughed, hesitated, his heart seized, terrified that it might refuse to start, that he might be stranded here in the open, with the shredded trash bag. And the handwritten warning lying in a neat, deliberate tableau beside the tire, but on the third turn the motor caught, sputtering into a rough idle that shook the cab with anxious vibrations as though the truck itself shared his fear of being too close to the tree line. He shifted into gear immediately, not caring about tire spin or gravel spray, and sped back onto the empty highway, headlights cutting two pale tunnels into the night as the rest area and the turnout vanished behind him like the mouth of something waiting to swallow a slower manhole. For several long minutes, his only thought was get away, as far as possible, as fast as possible, from the forest that had risen up against him like a living organism, from the creature that had outrun his truck, from the whispered voices that had crawled through the cabin like roots seeking weakness. But distance did nothing to calm him, his pulse hammered in his throat, each beat sharp and painful, and the tremor in his hands refused to fade even as the highway widened, even as the forest fell back into a distant outline behind him. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, habitual, compulsive, terrified, not because he expected the creature to follow him onto the highway, but because the silence it left behind felt worse, like a breath held too long, like the pause before an aftershock. The gouges in the truck's metal scraped faintly as the vehicle reached higher speeds, the torn steel flexing with the wind, creating an intermittent howl that brushed against the cab in uneven pitches. At first he told himself it was only the damage, nothing more, but the sound, thin, hollow, rising and falling with uncanny rhythm, began to resemble a distant voice, a low moan carried through the air. And the hairs on his arms rose as though responding to something unseen. He turned up the radio to drown it out, but all he got was static. Not the kind of static that comes from poor reception. No hissing, no crackling. Just a deep, throbbing hum, pulsing in slow intervals like the heartbeat of something enormous. He snapped it off immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse. He tried to focus on the road ahead, the reassuring normalcy of distant exit signs and reflectors glinting under his headlights, but his eyes kept drifting to the passenger side mirror, drawn as if by invisible threads. Each time he checked, the highway behind him remained empty, a pale ribbon tapering into darkness, but the faint, irrational impression persisted that something large had once been there, just outside the reach of the lights, and that he was not so much escaping the forest as being allowed to leave. He shook his head violently, muttering to himself, "No. You're out. You're fine. It's just fear. Just shock." But the words were brittle, hollow, unconvincing even to his own ears. By the time he reached the next town, the tension in his muscles had shifted into an electric kind of exhaustion, every nerve stretched thin, trembling with residual adrenaline, and he pulled into the nearest gas station, brightly lit, mundane, humming with the comfort of fluorescent lights. A couple of late-night travelers browsed the aisles inside, a clerk leaned lazily on the counter. Everything here felt solid, human, blissfully indifferent to cursed forests or ancient rules. Yet as he stepped out to inspect the truck more clearly under the bright canopy lights, the sense of safety dissolved instantly. The damage was worse in fluorescence. Far worse. What he had thought were random gouges were now glaring, deliberate slashes, parallel lines carved with terrifying precision, some deep enough to expose the structural frame beneath. The rear panel was crushed inward in the exact shape of a massive grip, as though a hand, no, a claw, had closed around it with the casual strength of a falling tree. Roots and bits of torn bark were embedded into the shredded paint, fused to the metal as though grown into it. He felt cold all over, a creeping chill that pricked along his spine. This wasn't nature acting blindly. This wasn't wind, or debris, or panicked misinterpretation. This was intention. Fury. Retribution. He circled to the front of the truck, half hoping the shredded trash bag had somehow fallen off, blown away, anything, but it remained where he'd left it at the turnout, lying neatly in his mind like a curse. He checked anyway, scanning the grille, the bumper, the undercarriage, desperate to find nothing, and for a moment, he exhaled in relief. Until he saw the smear. Just below the headlight, streaked across the metal like a fingerprint dragged downward, was a wet, dark smear of soil, too damp, too thick, too fresh to have been picked up on any highway pavement. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched it lightly. It was cold. As cold as the forest floor after a deep rain. And beneath the scent of earth was something older, muskier, like decomposing roots wrapped in stagnant water. He jerked his hand back so fast he stumbled, wiping his fingers on his jeans, bile rising in his throat. The gas station lights flickered. Just once. A tiny, almost imperceptible blink. But the kind that made every muscle in his body lock tight. He spun around, scanning the lot, the fields beyond, the road. Nothing. No movement. No shadows where they shouldn't be. But the scent lingered. Wet soil. Roots. Decay. He took a large, shaky breath and forced himself into the driver's seat again, slamming the door, triple-checking the locks even though he knew locks didn't matter, not to something that had chased him through a forest like it was gliding across open ground. He started the engine again, desperate to hear a sound, any sound, that marked him as part of the ordinary world. And the moment he pulled out of the lot, his headlights illuminated something at the far edge of the road. Something small. Something pale. At first he thought it was litter, maybe a paper bag, maybe a forgotten rag. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakable. Something placed. Something meant for him. A second piece of old, yellowed paper. Resting upright against a rock as though carefully propped. His stomach plummeted. He slowed despite every instinct screaming not to, and as the headlights washed over the paper, the same looping handwriting revealed itself. En hung loi qua con nuoi, rom com quain. The mistakes of men are never forgotten by the woods. He didn't stop. He didn't dare. He accelerated so hard the tires shrieked, and the message disappeared behind him in a smear of pale yellow and dust. But even as the miles stretched between him and Blackwood, the air inside the truck refused to lighten. The scent of wet soil lingered, faint but persistent. The hum of static in the radio returned intermittently, pulsing like a heartbeat. And at one point, just once, David thought he heard a soft whisper curl from the back seat, so quiet it could have been imagination, but so clear it made his breath stutter. A single word, drawn out. Root heavy. Spoken in a language older than the forest signs, older than the roads, older than men. A word that felt like a promise. Or a threat. Or both. He didn't understand it. Not fully. But he understood enough. Because when he glanced in the rearview mirror, just a quick glance, just enough to reassure himself, he saw, in the far distance behind him, the silhouette line of the Blackwood forest. And the trees were leaning again. Only this time, they leaned in his direction. The passenger swap. The road stretched ahead in a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt, the kind of rural backroad in northern New York where the night pressed down like a heavy velvet curtain and even the trees seemed to lean closer as if listening, their branches knitting into a canopy that swallowed the last traces of daylight. Emily kept both hands on the wheel, leaning forward slightly as the headlights carved out a thin corridor of visibility through the darkness. The warm breath of the heater mixing with the faint scent of coffee from a paper cup she'd abandoned in the cup holder hours earlier, and though she was used to late drives, the long trek home after visiting her mother in Plattsburgh, tonight the emptiness felt sharper, deeper, as though the world had hollowed itself around her, leaving nothing but shadows and the hum of tires on cold pavement. The radio had fizzled out 20 minutes back, offering only static when she tried to find a station, so she drove in silence, occasionally glancing at the photo of her son clipped to the dashboard, a laughing 8-year-old with messy curls and one missing front tooth, holding a stick like a sword in their backyard, waving at her with unfiltered joy. She smiled faintly at the sight. He was the reason she tolerated these exhausting trips, but the smile faded when movement flickered on the right shoulder of the road, a shape pulling itself out of the darkness like someone stepping out from behind a curtain. She slowed instinctively, leaning toward the windshield. A woman stood near the ditch, illuminated in the edge of her high beams, young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a thin coat far too light for the chill of late autumn, her posture sagging as if her knees might buckle at any moment. One arm raised in a feeble attempt to wave down Emily's car, and the gesture was so small, so exhausted, that Emily felt her heart tighten in her chest. Out here, no one would stop for hours. She would want someone to stop if it were her. She pulled over, the tires crackling on frost-kissed gravel, and lowered her window just enough to speak. "Are you all right?" she called out, forcing her voice to sound steadier than she felt. The young woman stepped closer into the full glow of the headlights. Her face was pale, almost gray in the cold night air, and strands of dark hair clung to her cheeks like wet threads. "My car ran out of gas," the woman said softly, her voice carrying an odd flatness, as though spoken through too much exhaustion or not enough breath. "I've been walking forever. I don't know how much farther I can go." Emily nodded, glancing briefly up and down the empty road. "I can take you into town," she said. "It's about 10 miles. Hop in." The young woman, Anna, she said when Emily asked, didn't smile, didn't look relieved. She simply inclined her head once, in a gesture too formal to feel natural, and opened the passenger door with a slow, deliberate motion. Emily noticed two things immediately. The door made no sound, not even the soft thump of air pressure shifting, and the girl moved with a kind of strange weightlessness, as if the cold didn't touch her. But before Emily could form a coherent thought around that, Anna was seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes staring straight ahead. Emily pulled back onto the road, casting an uneasy glance at her silent passenger. "So," she said, trying to lighten the air, "what were you doing out here this late? Visiting someone?" No answer. Emily tried again. "There's a gas station in town. I can drop you off there." Again, nothing. It was only when she risked a longer look that she noticed Anna wasn't staring out the windshield at all. She was staring at Emily's phone, mounted above the console, its lock screen still illuminated with the photo of her son. Anna's eyes were fixed on it with an unsettling intensity, the way someone might study a portrait of a long-lost friend or something they used to own. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "That's my boy," she said gently. "He's 8. Anna did not respond. Her gaze did not flicker. The silence grew heavier, thick enough that even the hum of the engine seemed to hush itself. The road ahead unfurled in endless black, and with each passing mile, Emily became aware of a subtle change in the air, a faint chill seeping into the cabin despite the heater, tightening around her arms and neck like someone lightly trailing their fingers over her skin. She gripped the wheel a little tighter, glancing again at her passenger. "Are you warm enough?" she asked. Anna blinked, a slow, delayed movement. "I'm fine," she said, voice flat but oddly careful, as if tasting the words before releasing them. The town lights finally appeared over the next rise, small, distant stars scattered across the horizon, and Emily felt a flicker of relief. She reached for the turn signal, ready to take the final curve into the outskirts when Anna suddenly spoke again, her voice soft but unnaturally clear in the stillness. "Thank you for stopping," she murmured. "Most people don't." Emily forced a smile. "Of course. I couldn't leave you out there." Anna's head turned then, slowly, unnervingly smoothly, until her eyes met Emily's in a way that made the temperature in the car dip several degrees. "Can I ask you something?" Emily swallowed. "Sure." Anna's lips twitched upward, forming a smile that was not warm, not grateful, just wrong. "Could I drive the rest of the way?" she asked. A pause. "Just a little. I'd like to sit where you're sitting." Every instinct in Emily's body recoiled. Her grip tightened on the wheel. "No," she said after a beat, forcing steadiness. "I'm all right. We're almost there." Anna's smile widened, stretching in a slow, unnatural arc that never reached her eyes. "I see," she whispered. "That's all right. I just thought it might be my turn." "My turn?" Emily repeated, a shiver crawling up her spine. But Anna didn't explain. She simply turned her gaze back to the phone displaying the picture of Emily's son, her expression softening into something too tender to be comforting, too knowing to be accidental. And then the lights of town grew brighter, and Emily exhaled shakily, telling herself she'd drop the girl off, wish her well, and try to forget the strange encounter. She glanced in the rearview mirror to reassure herself that they were minutes away. But her voice caught in her throat. The back seat was empty. Completely empty. No indentation in the cushion. No sound of a door opening. No shift in weight. Just vacant space where someone, something, had been sitting seconds earlier. Emily's breath stuttered out in a gasp as she jerked the wheel, pulling the car to a sudden stop on the shoulder, heart thundering. She turned around fully. No one. And then, slowly, as the heater fogged the cold windshield in a thin, ghostly haze, a message appeared, drawn from the inside, letter strokes forming through the condensation with deliberate slowness, as though written by a fingertip pressing from the other side of the glass. "I made friends with your son. He'll be the next one to drive." Emily's scream died in her throat. Emily lunged forward and slammed the car back into drive with a force that made her wrist sting, the tires screeching as she pulled off the shoulder and accelerated far harder than her old Subaru was designed to handle, the engine protesting in a high, strained whine that barely cut through the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. The message on the fogged windshield hung in her periphery like a bruise on the air. "I made friends with your son. He'll be the next one to drive." And even though she refused to look at it again, the words burned themselves into her memory with a clarity that made her stomach seize and her breath fracture into panicked shreds. The night outside seemed to grow deeper the faster she drove, the trees on either side closing in until they felt like tall silhouettes craning forward to watch her flee, the empty road unspooling beneath her headlights like something pulled taut and fragile, ready to snap at the slightest tremor. She kept glancing into the rearview mirror instinctively, mindlessly, as though her body expected Anna to reappear there, leaning in the seat, grinning that cold, too even grin, but each time, the back seat remained empty, and the empty space somehow felt worse, as though it weren't truly empty at all but waiting, like a lung half-filled, drawing breath for something she couldn't see. Her phone buzzed in the console, the vibration startling her so violently she swerved, and when her eyes darted toward the screen she saw a notification banner. "Camera motion detected, nursery, upstairs." Her breath hitched with an audible snap. Not now. Not tonight. Not while she was still miles from home. She fumbled for the phone but couldn't unlock it while driving. Instead she shoved it face down, as though hiding the notification might undo its meaning, and pressed harder on the gas. The forest finally broke open into familiar farmland, the dim silhouettes of barns and fence lines emerging like memories resurfacing from a fog, and her headlights bounced over the cracked pavement as she raced through the final stretch toward her neighborhood, a cul-de-sac tucked behind a grove of maples that usually felt comforting, small-town safe, but tonight seemed too dark, too still, too removed from the living world. She turned onto her street with a screech, brake rotors whining, and rolled into her driveway without bothering to park straight. She killed the engine, threw open the door, and sprinted toward the house, keys rattling violently in her shaking hands. The porch light flickered once, a perfectly timed betrayal, and the deadbolt resisted her fumbling grip for agonizing seconds before she forced it open, bursting into the quiet hallway with her breath caught halfway between a sob and a plea. "Evan," she called out, voice cracking on the single word. No answer. She didn't turn on the lights, couldn't waste a second. She ran. Past the kitchen, past the living room, up the stairs two at a time, gripping the banister so hard her knuckles ached. She reached the top landing, heart thundering against her ribs, and turned toward her son's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been when she left that afternoon. She always closed it fully to keep the dog from dragging toys out. Her hand hovered above the doorknob, trembling so violently it rattled the metal. She pushed the door open slowly, every inch widening a corridor of dread, and the moonlight spilling through the curtains cast a soft silver glow across the room. Evan lay in bed, cheeks flushed with the deep, peaceful sleep of young children who hadn't yet learned fear the way adults had. His small hand was curled loosely around something resting on his chest, something pale, oddly shaped, slightly reflective in the low light. Emily took a cautious step closer. Then another. Her breath caught as the object came into focus. A comb. Old. Bone-colored. Decorated with faint, fading carvings like filigree etched into ivory. A comb she had never seen in her life. A comb she recognized instantly from the brief moment Anna had stepped into her headlights, dangling from the strap of her bag like a token, like an heirloom, like something too personal to forget. Her lungs seized. Her legs almost buckled. She reached out slowly, achingly slow, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to touch the object either, caught between maternal instinct and supernatural dread. When her fingertips brushed the comb, it was colder than expected, unnaturally cold, as if it had been sitting outside in freezing weather rather than clasped in a sleeping child's hand. Evan stirred softly at the touch, but didn't wake. His lips parted, releasing a small sigh. And then a second sound followed. A whisper. So faint she thought it was the curtains shifting. But the whisper came from the comb. From the cold bone nestled in her son's hand. A hush of breath, a single syllable, shapeless and soft, like someone speaking from the bottom of a long hallway. Emily recoiled, her hand trembling uncontrollably. She pulled the comb free from his fingers and hurriedly tucked it into the pocket of her jacket, heart lurching when she felt the unnatural chill bleeding through the fabric. She backed out of the room on unsteady feet, pulling the door almost closed, but not entirely, just enough to see Evan's chest rise and fall in calm, unharmed rhythm. Downstairs, she grabbed the trash bin, stuffed the comb deep beneath the bag, and walked it straight out to the curb, forcing the lid down with a harsh clatter. The cold wind brushed against her neck as though someone passed by her too closely, but she didn't turn around. She marched back into the house, locked every door, latched every window, bolted the chain, and then sank onto the living room floor with her head in her hands, breath shaking violently. She stayed like that for a long time until exhaustion dragged her into a restless sleep, curled against the couch like someone hiding from a storm. It was the phone's vibration that woke her. A single buzz. Then another. Then another. Her eyes snapped open. The sun had risen, soft morning light filtering through the blinds, but the dread that flooded her body was immediate, overwhelming, instinctive. She reached for the phone with numb fingers and looked at the screen. One new message, unknown number. Her pulse hammered. She tapped the notification. The message was short. Too short. Terrifyingly familiar in tone. Contre ko dang doi ko o dead man's curve. No can ko da gatn. Emily's breath froze. Dead man's curve. A sharp bend in the rural highway. The place her ex-husband had died. The place people still left offerings. The place where the air always felt wrong. Her son was upstairs, sleeping safely. But the message didn't say he'd been taken. It said he was waiting. As if part of him, some fragment, some reflection, some swapped piece, was already there. A tremor passed through the house then, so faint she might have missed it. Except the curtains fluttered. The heater stuttered. And from somewhere near the front door came a soft, unmistakable tap. Like a fingertip. On glass. Emily moved through the house as if it were suddenly unfamiliar terrain, each room carrying a strange, tilted weight, the kind that settles after something unseen has passed through and rearranged the air without touching a single object. Her phone buzzed once more in her hand, that same message glowing like a warning: "Your son is waiting for you at Dead Man's Curve. He needs you to burn some paper money," and the words clung to her ribs like cold wire as she climbed the stairs. When she eased open Evan's bedroom door, the breath left her chest in a stutter because her son, who had fallen asleep curled on his side, now lay perfectly straight on his back as if placed there with quiet intentionality, his small hands resting at his sides, his face angled toward the window that pointed directly toward the winding road where his father had died years ago. His lips moved in a faint, breathless whisper, like someone repeating instructions in their sleep, and when Emily stepped closer the floorboard creaked under her weight, loud enough that Evan's eyes snapped open, wide and dark and startlingly alert. Relief washed her for a single heartbeat before she noticed the slight delay in his blink, the way his gaze drifted past her shoulder as though following someone stepping out of view. She spun around, finding nothing but a patch of shadow that felt too dense, too occupied. "I had a visitor," Evan murmured, his voice calm in a way that made her stomach knot. "The lady from the road." Emily's throat tightened as he added, almost gently, she said, "I'm next." A cold ripple crawled along her skin. She grabbed his shoulders, pulling him toward her in a desperate embrace, feeling the warmth of his small body against her chest even as her mind raced with horror, because he shouldn't know her, should never have seen her, shouldn't be echoing the cadence of that strange young woman who'd sat in her passenger seat like a hollowed-out echo of something not fully human. When she lifted him from the bed and hurried toward the stairs, he clung to her, and for a moment she felt the familiar weight of her child, until he tugged her sleeve softly and whispered, "We don't have to run, Mom. She said she can only swap places if we invite her." Emily froze at the foot of the stairs, her breath catching in her throat, the keys slipping in her trembling hand. "Invite her," she echoed, voice barely a sound. Evan nodded toward the front door, toward the frosted glass pane that suddenly seemed too thin, too fragile, separating her from whatever waited outside. "She's there," he murmured. "She wants your seat next." And as Emily stared, heart thundering, the doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately, like someone rotating it with the careful patience of a person who already knows they will be allowed, and eventually, whether through a mistake, a whisper, or the trembling yes that slips from a mother too frightened to think clearly. Emily's breath snagged painfully in her throat as the doorknob turned that slow, deliberate inch, the metal shifting with the soft groan of something that had been waiting for this moment far longer than she'd been alive, and she staggered backward with Evan clutched against her chest, his small fingers gripping her coat with an eerie mixture of fear and calm curiosity. The house seemed to inhale with them, every wall tightening as though bracing for a second knock that never came, and instead, the silence deepened until it felt almost viscous, a thick gel of dread settling over the living room. She backed toward the kitchen, heart hammering in sharp, uneven rhythm, whispering to Evan not to look at the door, not to listen, not to answer if he heard anything, her voice trembling so badly that she barely recognized it as her own, yet he kept glancing over her shoulder with a half-tilted head, as if something behind the door were whispering through the gaps, speaking to him in a tone that bypassed the living entirely. She sat him on the table long enough to snatch her keys, but before she could rush him out the back exit, her phone vibrated again with a brightness that cut through the murk like a siren, and against her better judgment she glanced down. A new message glowed from the same unknown number: "The seat is ready. Dead Man's Curve is the crossing point. Bring him." Emily nearly dropped the phone. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction. A rule. A ritual. Something that expected obedience. She forced herself to move, dragging Evan toward the garage door, fumbling with the lock, but the moment she touched the handle, the lights in the hallway flickered, once, twice, and then steadied with a low hum that resonated through her bones like a warning. Evan's face shifted in the half-light, the innocence still there but layered under something else, something watching from behind his eyes, and he whispered, "Mom, she says we should hurry. It's almost time." Emily felt a wave of vertigo at the edges of her vision, the house bending slightly as though gravity itself leaned toward the front door, toward the thing waiting patiently on the other side. "Don't listen to her," Emily snapped, her voice sharp, breathless. "She's not real, she's not a person, she's not," but she couldn't finish the sentence, because even saying the words made the doorknob turn another degree, a soft click following as if in agreement. She grabbed Evan and rushed him into the garage, slamming the door behind them. Her hands shook violently as she strapped him into the car seat, and when she turned to throw herself into the driver's seat, the garage lights flickered too. Anna, or whatever she was not bound to rooms or thresholds. She was bound to Emily. To the driver's seat, to the act of taking someone from one place to another, a ritual of escorting, ferrying, exchanging. The rules clicked together in Emily's mind like puzzle pieces falling into place in a nightmare. Anna didn't want companionship, she wanted a seat. Not in a metaphorical sense. In a literal, physical, ritualistic sense. A seat that belonged to the living. A seat she could take by swapping herself into the world through proximity, invitation, or a weakening boundary. Emily jammed the key into the ignition, her fingers slick with sweat, and the engine coughed awake with a low growl that almost sounded reluctant. She threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as she backed out of the driveway too fast, nearly taking out a trash bin, and when she whipped onto the street she felt the unmistakable sensation of weight settling into the back seat even though she hadn't heard the door open. She didn't dare look. Something inside her knew that looking would give whatever sat there permission it hadn't yet earned. The farther she drove, the louder the wind seemed to howl around the car, though the trees lining her neighborhood barely moved. Evan watched her silently from the rearview mirror, his expression shifting between her son's normal sleepiness and something else, something reflective, like someone standing behind a window inside him and watching her with intent. "Are we going to her road?" he whispered. "She says the curve is where people switch sides." Emily shook her head violently, tears blurring the edges of the street. "No, sweetheart, we are going somewhere public, somewhere safe, we're going to the police." But her phone vibrated violently again. A call this time. From the same unknown number. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But the voicemail notification chimed almost immediately, and, God help her, it began to play automatically through the car's Bluetooth, a low breath, soft and wet like someone whispering into a cold window, followed by a woman's voice speaking with that hollow calm she'd heard in the passenger seat, saying, "You can't run from a road you've already driven, Emily. The curve remembers him. And it remembers you." Emily's grip tightened so hard on the steering wheel her nails dug crescent moons into her palms. The curve. Dead Man's Curve. The stretch of road where her ex-husband's car had veered off into the ravine on a rainy night 2 years ago. The place where she'd driven after the funeral, headlights cutting through fog as she sobbed and begged for a sign that he wasn't gone. The place where she had felt, not seen, not heard, but felt, someone sitting in the back seat behind her, breathing softly, as though she'd already carried a passenger she didn't invite. A chill spread through her now, slow and cold, as if filling her bones from the inside. This hadn't started last night. It hadn't started with the hitchhiker. This thing had been riding with her for years, waiting for a moment when she would be vulnerable enough, broken enough, distracted enough for it to slide one seat closer. As she approached the edge of town, the fog thickened, swirling across the road like drifting smoke. Evan whispered from the back seat, "Mom. She says you're almost there." Emily forced her eyes forward, blinking away tears, refusing to look in the mirror even as she felt the pressure of unseen eyes pressing against the glass. The edge of the forest rose on either side of the road, framing the narrowing path toward the bend ahead. The air grew colder still, so cold her breath fogged the interior of the car. The radio flicked on by itself, static swelling like a ragged exhale. And then, through the fog, she saw the yellow road sign, Dead Man's Curve, 500 feet. Evan leaned forward as much as his seatbelt allowed, his voice lilting into a tone that didn't belong to him, a tone borrowed from someone else, someone who had once sat in this car with her on a night filled with grief. "Mom," he whispered softly, "she says it's time to switch." Fog swallowed the road entirely as Emily crept toward the bend, her headlights weakening against a wall of white that rolled across the pavement in thick waves, moving in long, silent breaths like something alive. The yellow warning sign, Dead Man's Curve, loomed for a moment and then dissolved behind her as if the fog had simply eaten it, and the silence inside the car grew so suffocating she felt her own heartbeat echoing inside her skull. Evan sat rigid in his seat, his small hands resting unnaturally still on his lap, his face ghost pale in the dim dashboard glow, and every so often his pupils flicked upward toward the rearview mirror, not in fear but in recognition, as if checking on someone sitting directly behind Emily. She refused to look. Even when she felt the back seat dip slightly. Even when the faint smell of damp earth and old perfume, nothing she recognized from her world, rose from the dark space behind her shoulder. The fog parted just enough for her to see the deadly curve ahead, a sharp hook of asphalt hugging a ravine, the guardrail bent from decades of crashes, the trees leaning over it like mourners watching the living speed by. Her hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white, breath jagged. "We're not stopping," she whispered, though her voice shook with terror. "We're not playing her game. We're going to get help," but Evan cut her off softly, calmly, in a voice that wasn't quite his. "Mom, she says you already played the game. The night Dad died." Emily's breath froze. The night of the accident, she had driven behind her husband by 10 minutes, far enough not to see the crash but close enough to smell burning rubber when she reached the curve, close enough to feel something sit in her back seat while she waited for the ambulance, close enough to whisper to the darkness that she would give anything, anything, to take his place for one more hour, one more moment, one more breath. "You traded then," Evan murmured, his eyes half-lidded. "You gave her a seat, Mom." A soft exhale drifted across the back of her neck, as cold as breath on a winter window. The radio crackled to life on its own, resolving into a faint voice singing an old lullaby, "Ride with me, stay with me, take the winding road," a song she vaguely remembered from her childhood, the melody skewed and warped, as if sung underwater. Emily gritted her teeth and pressed the accelerator, but the car shuddered violently, engine sputtering, speed dropping no matter how hard she pushed. Something was slowing them. Something outside the physics of the living. Panic clawed at her throat. She slammed her palm against the wheel. "Leave my son alone," she cried, tears burning down her cheeks. "Take me if you want someone, take me instead." For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Evan whispered, "She doesn't want you anymore." A pause. Sharp, cruel, final. "She wants the one who can replace her." Emily's stomach turned. "The one who will take her place on the road," he finished. "The one who will drive forever." And that was when Emily understood. This wasn't a ghost looking for vengeance. It was a ferryman, a walker of roads, a spirit bound to the curve, a soul trapped by the violence of its own death, needing a replacement to break its endless loop of wandering. And the easiest vessel to slip into was a child. Someone unguarded. Someone open. Someone who could be nudged out of the world without anyone noticing the exact second the switch happened. "No," Emily whispered, the word cracking. "No, she can't take him. She can't." But the fog thickened, swirling around the car like a cage, and for the first time she saw a silhouette forming in the rearview mirror, not a reflection but a figure sitting directly behind her seat, leaning forward with slow, unnatural grace. Long dark hair clung to a hollow face devoid of features except for the faint shimmer of two shallow indentations where eyes should be, and a mouth that wasn't a mouth at all but a thin crack in the shape of a smile. It hovered a breath away from the mirror's glass, as if pressing toward her. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to look, but her son's voice, too calm, too steady, broke through her trembling. She said, "All you have to do is say yes." The car slowed on its own. The curve loomed. The ravine waited. And the fog whispered. Emily forced her eyes open, tears blurring the road. "You can't have him," she gasped. "You'll never have him." Another whisper slid across the interior of the car, soft, feminine, coaxing. "Then who will take my place?" Emily's heart thundered, a wild, primal thing. She could feel the rules bending around her, the ritual tightening like a noose. A driver must be offered. A seat must be surrendered. A soul must take the curve. She did the only thing a mother could. She jerked the wheel. Hard. The car swerved violently, not toward the ravine but sideways, straight into the old gravel pullover just before the bend, slamming to a stop inches from the guardrail. The force drew the fog backward in a startled hush. Evan screamed as the seat jerked, but when Emily twisted around, heart in her throat, the back seat was empty. Completely empty. No Anna. No silhouette. No dipping cushion. Just her son, sobbing, confused, alive. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breath. Then a sound drifted through the fog. A soft, distant screech of tires. A shape flickering through white. A car, an old model she didn't recognize, appearing for a single impossible moment on the curve, swerving, crashing silently, looping through the same doomed motion as if replayed from a memory that didn't belong to her. The fog swallowed it whole. Evan clung to her, shaking, and she held him until the sun finally broke through the tree line. Only then did she gather herself and start the car again, driving slowly away from the curve without once looking back. But that night, as she tucked Evan into bed, she noticed something wedged beneath his pillow. A comb. Bone-colored. Carved with old patterns. Cold as the grave. She threw it out instantly, hands trembling, burying it beneath bags of trash. But in the morning, her phone buzzed from an unknown number. Another driver will come. Another seat will open. Roads remember every promise. And when she looked out the window, fog curled along the street, as though waiting for the next car to pass by. Dead air. The apartment was the kind of place you ended up in only after life had peeled away every layer of comfort you once believed you deserved, its cracked plaster walls sagging inward, the lone window filmed with grime and city soot, its frame tattooed with the faint outline of a yellow talisman someone before her had desperately smoothed against the glass as though trying to keep something out, or trap something in. But Suri Bingyuan didn't care about superstition anymore, not since she had stopped believing in luck entirely, not since the world had shown her exactly how quickly it could turn on a woman who let herself be fooled by affection, money, and the illusion of stability. The landlord had offered the room for 100 yuan a month, a price so low it felt like an insult. But even an insult was something she could afford, and Suri had signed the lease without negotiating, without thinking, without anything except the hollow certainty that she no longer had a home anywhere else. She'd peeled off the yellow talisman the first night because its curled edges annoyed her, tossed it in the trash, and wiped the glue stain with the sleeve of her sweater, a sweater peeled from years of washing it in too hot water in the bathroom sink of a man who had never intended to keep her. She had been someone else once, a woman who tasted oysters from hotel room service trays, who drank wine that didn't come in cartons, who wore perfume she didn't have to ration, a woman who'd been kept soft and sheltered by a man much older than she was, a man she used to call affectionately Old Ghost, because he looked halfway to the grave even when he was alive, his skin loose, his breath sour, his money flowing like oxygen into her life. But money couldn't fix the things that went wrong between people, and loneliness could bloom in a mansion just as easily as in a crumbling rental. And so one night she had slipped back to the man she had loved in college, just once, she had told herself, just one more reminder of who she used to be. Only Old Ghost had discovered the messages. Only Old Ghost had been standing in the kitchen when she returned. Only Old Ghost had collapsed on the polished tile floor minutes later, clutching his chest, gasping for air, his face contorting in an expression so grotesque that she still saw it when she closed her eyes at night, the cheap glow of her current apartment's broken ceiling bulb flickering in the exact same pattern his twitching eyelids had made during his final breaths. The family had torn her apart afterward. His legal wife, Ha Tin, a woman with a surgeon's precision in her insults, had spat on the floor when Suri arrived at the funeral. "You killed him," she had hissed. "And you still expect sympathy?" His children had only glared, but their silence, their refusal to acknowledge her, cut deeper than the insults. There had been no inheritance. No apartment. No apology. No trace she had ever existed in his life. The worst part wasn't even losing him. The worst part was losing the version of herself she had built on his money, the illusion she was ascending, that she was becoming someone worth more than the girl with cheap shoes and cheaper dreams who'd first arrived in the city. A week later, the market crashed, wiping out her remaining savings. She pawned her jewelry, fake gold, as it turned out. She pawned her handbags, real, but low resale value. She pawned her pride last. It got her exactly enough to move into this room and buy one small thing that felt like company, a beat-up, second-hand radio from a street vendor who smiled with too many teeth and said, "It still works most nights." Most nights. The phrase had stuck to her. She set the radio on the wobbly table beside her thin mattress and turned the dial until a voice crackled through the static, sometimes a late-night newsreader, sometimes a talk show rerun, sometimes a movie broadcast she had seen 1,000 times when her life still included cable. The voices filled the narrow space with something warmer than silence, and on nights when she was too hungry to sleep or too ashamed to cry, she imagined the radio wasn't just transmitting sound but holding her upright, stitching the loose parts of her mind back into something resembling a person. Tonight the hunger gnawed deeper than usual. She hadn't eaten more than instant noodles in 2 days, and the cold autumn air creeping through the unsealed window made her bones feel hollow. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, listening to the radio's low murmur. The voice tonight belonged to a man reading poetry, not very good poetry, but his voice was deep enough to settle into her chest like a memory of warmth. She lay back, letting her eyes drift shut. The hunger softened, blurring into something easier to ignore. Then came the other sound. A sharp, rhythmic thudding. Wet. Clothes. So close it might have been coming from the mattress beneath her. At first she thought it was the radiator, some ancient pipe expanding and contracting with the temperature change, but the rhythm was wrong, too precise. Too human. Thud, 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 thud. Like someone chopping vegetables with a heavy cleaver, the blade landing again and again into a thick wooden cutting board. She sat up slowly, pulse crawling up her spine. "That's not real," she whispered to the room, as if saying it might make it true. The radio hissed softly, then returned to the poet's voice. Suri held her breath. The chopping stopped. But the silence felt wrong. As though the sound had stopped not because it had ended but because someone knew she was listening. She tried to swallow but her throat was dry. The apartment next to her was abandoned, the one below was half collapsed and filled with debris. She lived, as the landlord had cheerfully bragged, in a solitary room, the kind people rented when they wanted peace or anonymity or a place cheap enough that no one asked questions. Outside, the wind brushed the building with a long, low sigh. Inside, the radio flickered with a sudden pop, the poet's voice stuttering, dissolving into static. But in the static, she heard something else. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging lightly across a wooden countertop. Then a wet squelch. Then the unmistakable sound of a knife sliding through something soft. Her vision swam. She clutched her stomach as hunger sharpened into nausea, her memories flickering like film, oysters and champagne sauce, eaten in a hotel room, wine she hadn't paid for, a table filled with rich, glossy dishes she barely remembered tasting. She had eaten so well once, so well she thought the luxury would never end. Now even thinking about food made her dizzy. She pressed her palms to her ears. But the sound kept going. Closer now. Right behind her head. Like a whisper against her skull. For a moment she saw old Ghost, not as he had lived, but as he had died, his face bloated with the makeup someone had hastily applied for the wake, powder caked into creases, lipstick smeared slightly upward, giving him a smiling expression he had never worn in life. The makeup had made him look like a grotesque stage clown, a painted cadaver, and she had avoided looking at him at the funeral because she felt, irrationally, that the corpse might open its eyes and blame her. Now she imagined him looking down at her again, peering through the cracks in her ceiling the way he had peered through her life, watching her, judging her, refusing to leave her alone even in death. She blinked hard, shaking her head. She was tired. Starving. Lonely enough that the radio felt like a companion, lonely enough that she was starting to blur the line between real and imagined. Still. The sound returned. A single chop. Then another. Then a slow, deliberate scrape. Right next to her ear. She curled onto the mattress, pulled the blanket over her head, and turned the radio louder, not because the sound comforted her but because drowning in a stranger's voice was still better than drowning in her own thoughts, her own memories, her own ghosts. Tonight, just like most nights, she told herself the same lie. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow something will get better. Tomorrow this room won't feel so small. So cold. So haunted by the living more than the dead. But the chopping sound stayed with her until sunrise, steady and cruel, like the heartbeat of the life she had thrown away. By the second week in that collapsing apartment, time began to slip around Surrey in uneven pieces, hours that stretched like overworked dough and minutes that snapped like brittle wire, so that she often found herself staring at the rust-stained sink or the peeling corner of wallpaper without any memory of the moments leading up to it, her mind drifting in and out of places she didn't intend to revisit. She moved through her days with a numb, almost dreamlike heaviness, the kind that settles into a person who hasn't spoken to another human in too long, who hasn't eaten well in too long, who hasn't forgiven herself for even longer. The radio became the closest thing to a pulse in the room. Sometimes she turned it on without meaning to, her fingers twisting the dial as though pulled by reflex rather than intention, letting the voices spill into the stale air like spilled light. Late-night talk shows where hosts laughed too loudly at their own jokes, dramatic serials with actors whose diction was too crisp to be real, news anchors listing tragedies that belonged to other people. At night, when hunger gnawed deep enough that her whole body trembled, she let the radio run until dawn, the static filling the long hours with a strange artificial companionship. It was easier to hear a stranger's voice drifting through the static than the echo of her own breathing, easier to pretend that someone, somewhere, still knew she existed. But the static had begun to change. Not in a supernatural way. Surrey wasn't foolish enough to believe in ghosts or curses, but in the way her mind filtered it. Exhaustion sharpened her senses until the fuzz and interference sounded like whispers. Hunger hollowed her stomach until every pop in the signal felt like a heartbeat. One night, near midnight, she lay curled beneath her thin blanket, staring at the shadow of the window frame cast on the opposite wall. A voice drifted through the radio, low, male, narrating something about the moon, maybe a poem, maybe a short story, but the words blurred at the edges, slipping through her comprehension like water. She shut her eyes and imagined the warmth of hotel beds, the soft music in penthouse suites, the scent of her old perfume mixing with oysters and Sauvignon Blanc. The contrast was so violent her chest ached. She could still hear old Ghost's labored breathing on the night he died, still see the confusion and betrayal on his face, though she told herself, over and over, that she hadn't killed him. People died from strokes every day. People's hearts stopped. If she had been unfaithful, if she had lied, if she had been ungrateful, that didn't make her a murderer. She repeated this to herself until tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, warm and salty, trickling into her hairline. And then, just as she began to drift into that thin, brittle space between waking and sleep, she heard it again. The chopping. Slow this time. Measured. Thud, thud, thud. Right next to her ear, as if someone were working in the dark behind her headboard. She jerked upright so fast her vision blurred, heart pounding against her ribs, breath lodged in her throat. The radio didn't flicker or falter. The voice on the program didn't react. Nothing in the room had changed. The hum of the refrigerator in the hallway downstairs continued its low mechanical sigh, the street lamp outside buzzed faintly, and the only sound in her room was the quiet rumble of the radio host's voice weaving between the static. The chopping had stopped the instant she moved. Which meant it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She pressed her palms against her temples, squeezing her skull as though she could force the fracture lines in her thoughts back together. She had barely eaten. She had barely slept. People heard things under those conditions, imagined whispers, phantom thuds, the grinding of old memories against the present moment. Her hands trembled as she got up and crossed the room, stepping over the single cardboard box that served as her nightstand, the floor cold enough beneath her feet to sting. She poured a cup of water from the cracked thermos, drank it in 2 gulps, and stared at her reflection in the tiny shard of mirror she'd salvaged from the trash. The woman staring back at her was thinner, her cheeks hollow, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She barely resembled the girl who had flirted with bartenders in Shanghai clubs, who had spent afternoons floating in hotel pools, who had once believed she would grow into a woman of comfort and security instead of someone scraping by at the edge of the world. Her stomach growled sharply, bending her forward with a quick flash of pain. She rummaged through her cabinets, empty except for a packet of salt, stale crackers gone soft from humidity, and a half-pint carton of milk she already knew smelled wrong. She sat on the floor and ate the crackers anyway, chewing slowly, letting them dissolve into a bland, soggy paste. Tears pricked her eyes again, but she wiped them away angrily. Self-pity wouldn't help. Neither would regret. There was no going back to the life she'd lost, not to old Ghost, not to the man who'd grown tired of her, not to the family who'd wanted to see her ruined, not to the version of herself who had believed she could outrun failure forever. When she finished the crackers, she turned the radio back up. The host had moved on to answering listener letters, his tone bright and performative. Sometimes, he said, the smallest things keep us alive, like a good song, or a voice you trust, or a memory that reminds you who you used to be. Suri let out a humorless breath. Who she used to be. Someone pampered, hopeful, naive. Someone who had believed in comfort the way children believed in magic. She lay on her side again, curling into a shape small enough to fit into her own arms, listening to the steady wash of static between the host's words. Just as her breathing began to slow, she heard it, faintly, tucked inside the static like a whisper hidden beneath music. Ding. The sound of a knife hitting wood. Then again. And again. Sharper this time. Insistent. Almost intentional. She squeezed her eyes shut. Stop it, she whispered. It's not real. It's not real. The chopping softened. Slowed. But did not stop. She felt the pressure behind her eyes again, the pressure of hunger, isolation, and something older, something more primal, the fear of being alone in a place where no one would notice if she screamed, cried, or disappeared entirely. Her breath hitched. Her mind kept replaying the image of old Ghost's face, painted for the wake, grotesque in the bright funeral lights, mouth curled upward in a parody of a smile, like he had one last joke to play on her. She saw that face now in the dark corner of her room, imagined it hovering near the ceiling leak, lurking behind the peeling wallpaper, peeking through the crack beneath the door. She told herself she didn't believe in hauntings. She told herself the world was cruel but not mystical. Still. The chopping continued. She turned the radio louder, so loud the speaker crackled. The chopping grew louder to match. Her pulse pounded in her neck, hot and frantic. In the dim glow of the radio dial, she whispered to no one. I can't keep living like this. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a cry for help. It was the simple truth. But the dark offered no comfort. No answer. Only the chopping, steady, patient, echoing the rhythm of a life unraveling grain by grain, cut by cut, hunger by hunger, mistake by mistake, until it became impossible to tell whether the sound came from outside her head or the hollowing inside her chest. By the time the Mid-Autumn Festival arrived, the holiday that once meant rooftop banquets, lanterns glowing like captive stars, and mooncakes filled with yolks so golden they looked lacquered, Suri could barely remember what celebration felt like, the city outside her window pulsed with life she was no longer part of, children laughing beneath strings of paper lanterns. Lovers taking photos by the river with plastic rabbit ears blinking on their heads, bakeries selling last-minute festival boxes. Tied with red silk, but none of it reached her except as distant sound drifting up through the stairwell, irritating in its cheerfulness. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The last cracker crumbs had long dissolved on her tongue, leaving only the stubborn ache of hunger coiling in her stomach like a desperate animal refusing to die. She tried to distract herself by cleaning, by boiling water she didn't drink, by rearranging the 3 items she owned on her rickety table, the radio, a chipped mug, and a comb missing 3 teeth. But the hunger hollowed her out until even the air seemed heavy enough to bruise her ribs. When she finally left the apartment that afternoon, her legs trembled with each step, and she kept one hand lightly on the wall as if the peeling paint were the only thing tethering her to the world. The streets outside were thick with festival crowds, vendors shouting discounts, children clutching mooncakes shaped like cartoon animals. She paused at a stall where a man in a stained apron displayed his discounted boxes, slightly dented packaging, last-day promotions, the kind of holiday offerings for people who didn't have enough money or pride to demand unbroken boxes. 20 yuan, the vendor said, tapping the cardboard. Suri stared at the box. They contained yolk-filled mooncakes, the kind the rich gifted casually, the kind she used to eat without tasting. 20 yuan. She had 13. 13 yuan in coins. She smiled bitterly, shaking her head. She walked away with the strange sense that even the discounted boxes were mocking her, not because of their price, but because they embodied a life she had once touched, briefly but brightly, like a firework fading before its smoke even reached the ground. The longer she walked, the clearer her memories became, not warm memories, but sharp ones, jagged and cutting. She remembered the hotel suites old ghost booked under her name. The kitchens filled with fragrant soups and sweetened lotus seeds. The gifts, the clothes, the quiet promise that she would never have to worry again. She remembered the first fight after he found messages from her college lover, his face purple with rage, his fist shaking, his breath sour like spoiled milk. She remembered her own voice, pleading, apologizing, lying. She remembered the night he died, the way the paramedics looked at her with suspicion as if they could smell guilt on her skin. And she remembered his wife's voice, sharp as a butcher's cleaver, slicing through whatever dignity she had left. Not a cent for you. Not even pity. You killed him, now die with your shame. Shame had become her shadow. Her companion. Her room. Her hunger. The festival crowds thinned as she wandered into more affluent neighborhoods, streets too polished to feel welcoming, lined with high-end stores displaying mooncake gift towers that cost more than she'd paid for rent in 3 months. She pressed her hand against her stomach again, swallowing the dizzy wave rising from her gut. She passed a jewelry store and caught her reflection in the darkened glass, sunken cheeks, tangled hair, lips cracked. A woman no one would claim. A woman people would step around if she fainted in the street. And somehow this last humiliation, the sight of herself reduced to this state, pulled something taut inside her. A string snapping. A final thread breaking. She stopped walking. Stood still beneath a lamppost flickering in the late afternoon sun. And a thought came to her, not like a whisper, not like madness, but like a cold, rational conclusion. I deserve something back. Not love. Not forgiveness. Not happiness. But something. A measurable return for the years she had given. Something old ghost owed her. Something the wife stole. Something she had lost while assuming there would always be more. She realized, with painful clarity, that she wasn't angry at poverty itself. She was angry at the way her life had plummeted so cleanly, so brutally, without a final chance to climb out. Angry that she had let other people dictate the value of her time, her youth, her body. Angry at herself for thinking she was clever enough to cheat the world and emerge unscathed. She didn't know how long she stood there before she turned around, but when she finally faced the direction she had come from, she felt a strange steadiness inside her, something like purpose, like direction, like oxygen after drowning in stale air. The city lights flickered on as dusk settled. Suri walked with surprising calm toward the upscale residential complex called Jean's Show Luxury Court, the place where old Ghost's widow lived now with her much younger boyfriend, a man with the smooth face and pleasant voice of a singer she once admired on the radio. The complex rose with glittering balconies and warm interior lights, each window a capsule of comfort she would never touch again. She felt no yearning, only resolve. At a street stall near the entrance, she purchased a single mooncake, the cheapest one, with a printed design already fading, the yolk thin and dry. She stared at it in her palm for a long time, imagining the way Ha-Tin would sneer, the way the boyfriend would laugh politely at her ragged clothes, the way they would look down on her as if she were a stray animal that had wandered too close to their gilded lives. She took the mooncake home. She sat at her chipped table. She opened the mooncake. She stared at its hollow center. And she made a decision. Night fell. The radio played a soft instrumental song, but she barely heard it. Her mind was quiet for the first time in weeks. Not peaceful, but quiet. She wrapped the mooncakes in a cheap plastic bag and walked back to the luxury complex. Every step felt steady, almost graceful, as if hunger had sharpened her senses rather than dulled them. She rang the doorbell. Ha-Tin opened the door, looking freshly manicured and faintly amused, like someone who enjoys watching a loser try to plead their case. Behind her, the young boyfriend leaned in the hallway, shirt unbuttoned at the top, humming a tune Suri recognized from the radio. "I came to apologize," Suri whispered. "I was wrong." Ha-Tin smirked, arms crossed. "You were. And you are nothing now." Suri nodded. Accepted the insult like a warm coat. "I just wanted to give you this," she said, holding out the mooncake box. "A gift for mid-autumn. I don't have much, but it's all I can offer." Ha-Tin took it with a laughing scoff. The boyfriend grinned. "Mooncakes? Really? Looks cheap," he said. "She must have bought it with the last yuan she owns." They laughed. Laughed with the confidence of people who had never starved. Laughed with the cruelty of those who had everything and wanted just a little more dignity extracted from those who had nothing. Suri bowed her head. "Enjoy them," she said. And she left. Halfway down the hallway, she felt her vision blur, not with regret, not with fear, but with a strange, hollowed-out lightness. The radio's music seemed to echo faintly from memory, its soft drifting notes guiding her down the stairs and onto the street. Somewhere behind her, a door closed. Somewhere above her, laughter faded. Somewhere outside her, the city kept living. But inside her, inside Suri Bingyuan, something had already died and something else had begun to quiet itself into a cold, determined stillness. She did not look back. Not once. The walk back to her apartment should have felt long, but Suri drifted through the streets as if the city were a corridor carved just for her, its festival lights paling into a blur of muted gold and washed-out red, its noise fading behind the steady hum in her ears that matched the low electric drone of her radio. She barely felt her feet touching the pavement, barely registered the lanterns overhead swaying in the dusk breeze or the couples taking photos under the paper moon projections. All she felt was a lightness, an unnatural, floating numbness, as though the hollow inside her chest had finally found a shape it could settle into. By the time she climbed the cracked stairwell back to her room, her hands were trembling with exhaustion, her stomach twisting in painful, rhythmic spasms of hunger she no longer had the strength to soothe. She set her keys on the table with a soft clatter and, without taking off her shoes, sank onto the mattress. The radio remained where she had left it, its dull plastic casing stained by age, the dial crooked from overuse, the speaker grill slightly warped, and as she turned the knob, a wash of warm static filled the room, crackling in erratic bursts like someone lighting matches in the dark. For once, static didn't frighten her. Static was something she understood. Static was the noise that filled the space between people. Static was loneliness translated into sound. Soon a voice emerged, a mellow male narrator speaking about mid-autumn traditions, the symbolism of reunion under the full moon, the sweetness of shared mooncakes. Suri let out a breath that trembled on the way out, half laugh, half sob, her throat constricting so tightly she had to swallow twice before she could breathe again. Reunion. Sweetness. She wondered what the narrator would say if he saw her room, her hands, her life. She wondered how many people listened to the same gentle voice while eating their festival dinners, lighting candles, slicing mooncakes filled with soft, rich yolks. The hunger sharpened. Her vision pulsed. She pressed her palm against her stomach and curled forward. Her mind drifted in and out of focus. She didn't think about Hatin or the boyfriend at first. She simply listened, letting the radio wash through her like water through cracked earth, until the narrator's voice became a blur and the static wove itself into something that sounded like breathing, slow and deep and patient. In that surreal half-conscious state, she imagined the luxury apartment behind its guarded gates, imagined the soft lighting in the entryway where she had stood hours ago, imagined Hatena's manicured fingers peeling back the thin plastic wrapping of the mooncake box. She didn't know exactly what she had expected the two of them to do after she left, argue, perhaps, or laugh harder, but it didn't take a vivid imagination to picture the scene. A woman like Hatin would not resist eating a mooncake on festival night. A man like her young lover would not resist teasing her as he took a bite first. Suri imagined them sitting at the glossy kitchen counter, the fluorescent light glinting off stainless steel appliances, the boyfriend lifting the mooncake to his mouth and making a joke about the handwriting on the box. She must have been desperate. Look at these shaky characters, and Hatin laughing, brushing flour dust off his cheek, insisting she could read anyone's script, even detect lies inside their curves and strokes. Suri imagined their teeth sinking into the soft crust, imagined the faint bitterness beneath the sweetness, imagined the metallic tang lingering on their tongues. Her body did not react with triumph. It reacted with silence. Cold, hard, absolute silence. She lay back on the mattress and stared at the ceiling leak, the water stain blooming like a rotten flower across the plaster. The radio hummed softly. Her breathing slowed. Her eyelids felt heavy, as though someone had placed stones on them. For a moment she wondered if she had a fever. The room seemed to sway slightly, as if the ground beneath the building were shifting. She closed her eyes and let the sensation take her. She woke sometime later to a soft whistle of wind at the window and a pressure behind her ears. The radio had shifted frequencies while she slept, something it often did when the wiring overheated, and now played only static. Thick static, like cotton-stuffed whispers, the kind that felt less like noise and more like presence. She stared at the radio for a long moment before sitting up. Her head pounded. Her mouth was dry. She reached for the thermos, found it empty, and considered getting water from the hallway tap. But her legs had not yet decided to support her. She lay back down, closed her eyes, listened. The static thickened. A click. A soft shift. Then, a voice. The evening news. She recognized the cadence immediately, the clipped, precise diction of broadcasters who spent years practicing how to speak calmly about tragedies. Authorities are investigating a suspected poisoning at Jean Show Luxury Court. Her heartbeat stopped. Where a woman in her 60s and a younger male companion were found unresponsive in their residence earlier this evening. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Paramedics reported the victims showed signs consistent with ingesting contaminated food. Her fingers dug into the mattress. Mooncakes recovered from the scene have been taken for forensic analysis. Her breath stuttered into a sharp inhale. A handwritten label was found with the box. The static fluctuated like breath between sentences. Police are requesting information regarding a thin woman in her 30s seen approaching the residence earlier today. Silence. Silence so deep she could hear her own pulse drumming like a drum inside her skull. Her throat closed. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Not with fear, but with the weight of inevitability. There was no turning back now. No future she could step into without shadows, no forgiveness the world would offer her. She rose slowly, stood on unsteady legs. moved toward the small shard of mirror on the wall. Her reflection swayed before coming into focus, sunken eyes, drawn cheeks, skin grayed by exhaustion and hunger. She looked like a dying ghost pretending to be human. She reached for her lipstick, one of the few remnants from her past life, and twisted it until the red column rose like a blade. She painted her lips carefully, the color too vivid for her gaunt face, bleeding slightly at the edges. The same shade she used to wear on nights when she felt expensive. Desired. Whole. But now it looked like blood. Looked like ending. Looked like the last mask she would ever put on. She placed the lipstick on the table. Picked up the razor she had been using for weeks to trim loose threads on her clothes. The metal felt cold. Final. The radio's static softened again, as if sensing her decision, the frequency lowering into something almost tender, like someone humming from very far away. She sat on the edge of her bed. Held her wrist out. Turned the blade. Pressed down. The pain came sharp and bright, but it was the relief she felt more, an exhale she had held for months, maybe years, escaping her chest. The blood welled quickly, warm and startling against her cold skin. She lay down carefully, as though settling into a familiar bed, and stared at the ceiling. Her breathing slowed. Her vision blurred. Her body untethered itself from its weight. Somewhere, faint and distant, she thought she heard the radio anchor again. Stock market soared today. The highest rise this quarter. She didn't smile. Didn't frown. Didn't react at all. She simply let go, not knowing, not caring, not realizing that the fortune she believed lost had, in her final hours, returned tenfold. Her blood soaked into the mattress. The static hummed in steady rhythm. The city celebrated outside. And Surrey Bingyuan slipped into the quiet gap between breaths, the same quiet gap where voices on the radio fade just before the next program begins. Morning arrived without ceremony, filtering into the room through the grime-streaked window as a thin, reluctant band of gray light, the kind that illuminated everything without making anything feel brighter, the kind that exposed dust, decay, and the quiet truth of things left behind. It touched Surrey's still hand first, then the dried trails of red along her wrist, then the smeared lipstick staining her chin like a final, careless signature. The room had grown cold overnight, the kind of cold that settled into porous walls and thin mattresses, and if any passerby had climbed the stairs and walked past her door, they might have felt a faint shift in the air, a faint heaviness behind the silence, but no one came. No one in the entire building had reason to check on her. No neighbor relied on her. No friend expected her. No family knew her address. And so the light crept over her alone, an indifferent witness, while the radio continued to hum beside her, its static now soft, rhythmic, almost soothing, as if keeping vigil for a woman who had only ever asked it to fill the empty space in her life. Outside, festival decorations still clung to railings and lampposts, the remains of last night's laughter echoing faintly along the alleyways as children kicked at paper lanterns and shopkeepers swept colored wrappers into piles. The world resumed itself without pause. Delivery trucks hissed by on the main road. Hawkers shouted breakfast specials. Somewhere, a woman scolded her child for running too close to the street. Somewhere, a man cursed at missing the bus. The mundane, unbroken machinery of daily life churned forward, oblivious to the small, crumpled figure lying beneath a cheap blanket in a room no one wanted to remember. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the landlord came to collect the monthly rent, that anyone knocked on her door. He tapped twice, impatient and distracted, rehearsing the excuse he planned to give his wife for why they were short on money again. When no answer came, he sighed loudly and muttered about tenants who slept too deeply. He knocked again. Still nothing. His irritation sharpened. He pulled out the spare key, warning the empty hallway, "If she brought a dog in here, I swear I'll," but the door swung open to silence. The smell hit him first, not rot, not yet, but something metallic and stale, the scent of a room that had exhaled for the last time. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, tracing shapes he did not want to understand, landing at last on the mattress and the unmoving silhouette atop it. His curse died halfway in his throat. For the first time that day, his voice fell quiet. He took a step back, then another. He closed the door. He locked it. He walked downstairs and called the authorities. He did not tell them her name right away. It took him a moment to remember it. And even then, he pronounced it incorrectly. When the police arrived, they observed the scene with the measured detachment of people who had seen dozens like it, too many lives ending in rooms too small, too cold, too forgotten. They photographed the radio, still buzzing faintly. They photographed the razor on the floor. They photographed the faint prints of her fingers on the windowsill, as if she had touched it gently before lying down. One officer shook his head. Another made notes without looking too closely at the body. They worked with a speed that revealed experience, not callousness, professionals who understood that the world produced tragedies faster than anyone could process them. One officer switched off the radio. Or tried to. The dial slipped as if resisting, catching on a frequency mid-change, and for a fraction of a second a clear voice sliced through the static, a woman's voice, crisp and bright, reading the financial news. The stock market continues its upward surge today. The officer frowned and pressed the power button again. The radio died. The room fell silent. The irony did not land on him. How could it? He didn't know her story. Didn't know she had once clung to stocks like a lifeline. Didn't know her investments, worthless to her in her final months, had soared wildly the moment she chose to stop living. He only saw a body. Only saw another statistic. Only saw a woman who had died alone. The report was filed quickly. Likely suicide, they wrote. No evidence of foul play. Victim deceased at scene. Her belongings were boxed with mechanical efficiency. A chipped mug. A broken comb. A few pieces of clothing. A lipstick. And the radio, placed last, still warm along its edges as if it had been speaking to her moments before she died. Her box was set aside with others in a storeroom labeled unclaimed personal effects. It would be months before anyone opened it again, if anyone ever did. That evening, as the city slipped into night, as lanterns were taken down and the autumn moon rose clean and pale above the rooftops, the radio in storage flickered once. Not supernaturally, just a quirk of aging circuitry, a leftover charge releasing itself into the air. The speaker crackled softly. A faint whisper of static escaped into the empty room, brushing across cardboard boxes and metal shelves before fading into nothing. But if someone had been there, someone with enough loneliness, enough hunger, enough sorrow, they might have sworn they heard a fragment of a familiar sign-off drifting through the air. Before you turn off the radio tonight, remember to listen, not just to the music, but to the silence between. That's where truth hides. And sometimes, where lives end. The sound dissolved back into the dark. The world kept turning. And Suri Bingyuan, who had once tasted luxury, who had once believed in affection, who had once fought for scraps of dignity, became exactly what she had feared most, a whisper in the static of a city that had forgotten her long before she stopped breathing. The hour has grown thin, and the signal that carried us through the dark is beginning to fade, slipping back into the static where forgotten voices go to rest. If you're still awake, don't worry, most people aren't meant to sleep easily after wandering through places like these. Stories have weight in the quiet hours, they settle differently in the mind, they echo longer, they press their fingerprints into the parts of you that only wake after midnight. But now it's time to return to your own room, your own breathing, your own familiar shadows. Leave the forest behind. Leave the highway. Leave the flicker in the rearview mirror. They'll be waiting here, in this pocket of darkness, whenever you choose to come back. Until then, keep the lights soft, keep the doors gently closed, and if the radio murmurs by itself sometime after 3, don't be afraid. Not everything that calls your name in the night means you harm. Some stories simply don't like to be left alone. Good night, traveler. Sleep, if the night allows it.